He had the cruelty to bring his pregnant mistress just to mock his wife, who had just lost their baby. But as he stepped out of the elevator, a man was waiting with a folder, and something that would change his life forever. The city of Chicago spread beneath Thaddeus Morissette like a glittering chessboard. Buildings, streets, and people all arranged into perfect geometric patterns that he observed from his $22 million penthouse. The late afternoon sun fractured against the Lake Michigan shoreline, scattering gold across the water and illuminating his private kingdom. Every glass panel of his floor-to-ceiling windows had been specially treated to eliminate glare, ensuring nothing obstructed his view, his city. Thaddeus swirled the 30-year-old Macallan in his crystal tumbler, watching the amber liquid catch the light. At 42, he had achieved what most men would need 3 lifetimes to accomplish. Morissette Investments managed over $80 billion in assets. His wealth management strategies were taught at Wharton and Harvard Business. His name appeared on the donor walls of Chicago's most prestigious institutions. "Mr. Morissette, your 7 o'clock has been confirmed at altitude," announced his assistant through the integrated home system, and Mrs. Morissette called to say she won't be attending the Schneider Foundation Gala this evening. She's still not feeling well. Thaddeus tightened his jaw. "Thank you, Stephanie." He set down his glass and walked to the bedroom wing of the penthouse, where a custom-tailored Tom Ford suit awaited him on the mechanical valet. The navy silk glinted under the recessed lighting. His fingers traced the monogrammed cufflinks on the dresser. TMM, Thaddeus Michael Morissette, small reminders of his brand that he kept close to his skin. The bedroom itself, like the rest of the penthouse, was a masterpiece of understated luxury. Italian marble, burnished woods, and fabrics so expensive they felt like nothing at all. And yet as he dressed, Thaddeus's eyes kept returning to the small pharmacy of medications arranged on Eleanor's nightstand. Fertility hormones, prenatal vitamins, prescriptions for anxiety, all failures, all reminders. He adjusted his tie, using the bedroom mirror to practice his smile, the one that graced Chicago Magazine's most influential cover last year. It was a precise calibration of confidence, approachability, and just enough intimidation to command respect. His silvering temples and the faint lines around his eyes didn't detract from his appearance. They merely suggested the wisdom that came with his success. What the mirror didn't show was the steel beneath, the ruthlessness that had allowed a middle-class boy from Cincinnati to become the man who now advised senators, celebrities, and tech billionaires on how to grow their fortunes. The calculatedness that had crushed competitors and reshaped Chicago's financial landscape. Thaddeus Morissette wasn't just wealthy. He was a force of nature that bent everything toward his will, everything except the most primal thing of all, creating life. 3 floors below, in a private section of the building reserved for Morissette Investments' exclusive client meetings, Vega Morello stood before another window, watching the same sunset, but seeing something entirely different. At 29, with sharp green eyes that never missed a detail and an ambition that radiated from her like heat, Vega had climbed from junior analyst to Thaddeus's right hand in just 3 years. Now, she rested her palm against the curve of her stomach, visible even under her carefully selected Armani dress. 5 months, she whispered to the window, to the child, to herself. 5 months, and everything changes. She checked her watch, a gift from Thaddeus when she closed the Henderson account, bringing $220 million under management. The affair had started shortly after. Late nights reviewing prospectuses, strategy sessions that evolved into dinner, then drinks, then his hand on her knee under a restaurant table. Her phone buzzed with a text. "My place, 1 hour. Wear the green dress." Vega smiled. There had been a time when she thought the affair was about sex, about the thrill of conquest. But Thaddeus had never treated her like a conquest. He'd treated her like an equal, something she suspected he'd never done with any woman, including his wife. She gathered her materials from the conference table, quarterly reports, client portfolios, market analyses, all impeccably prepared. Vega hadn't slept her way to the top. She'd earned every step of her ascent, and the pregnancy hadn't slowed her down. If anything, it had accelerated Thaddeus's trust in her, giving her access to client accounts and strategies that were typically reserved for partners. As she packed her leather portfolio, her fingers brushed against the small sonogram image she kept inside. A boy, A son for a man who'd been trying to create an heir with his wife for years. Vega knew what people would call her if they knew. Home wrecker, gold digger, slut. What they wouldn't understand was the connection, the recognition of similar souls. Thaddeus saw himself in her, the hunger, the precision, the willingness to do whatever it took, and soon he would see himself in their child. In the west wing of the penthouse, Eleanor Morissette sat in her private study, surrounded by art books and catalogues from exhibits she'd once curated. At 38, her beauty remained striking. High cheekbones, expressive eyes, and a quiet grace that 12 years of marriage to Thaddeus hadn't diminished. She stared at her laptop screen, reading the same email for the 5th time. It was from her former gallery director, offering her a consulting position on an upcoming Rothko exhibition. Once, this would have thrilled her. Now, it only deepened the hollow feeling inside. "Would you like me to prepare something light for dinner, Mrs. Morissette?" asked Marina, their housekeeper, from the doorway. Eleanor closed the laptop. "No, thank you. I'm not hungry. The doctor said you should try to eat regularly, especially after—" "I know what the doctor said," Eleanor interrupted, her voice soft but firm. "I'll have something later." Marina nodded and withdrew, leaving Eleanor alone with the silence that seemed to press against her eardrums. 6 weeks ago, she'd been lying in a hospital bed, blood soaking through sheets as doctors told her she'd lost the baby. 12 weeks into the pregnancy. Just when they'd started to hope. She rose and walked to the bathroom, where she splashed cold water on her face. The woman in the mirror looked like a stranger, pale with shadows under her eyes that expensive concealer couldn't quite hide. When had she become this person? This accessory to Thaddeus's life, defined by her failures to produce a child. Eleanor had once been Eleanor Renwick, the prodigy who'd become the youngest curator at the Chicago Museum of Contemporary Art. Collectors and artists had sought her opinion, her insight. She'd traveled to Basel, to Venice, to Tokyo, discovering new talent and shaping exhibitions that challenged and delighted critics. Then she'd met Thaddeus at a gallery opening. He'd been charming, brilliant, ambitious, and utterly captivated by her. Their courtship had been a whirlwind of private jets, midnight conversations about art and philosophy, and a passion that seemed boundless. When he'd proposed, offering her a life of unlimited resources to pursue her passions, she'd said yes without hesitation. The compromises had come gradually, first scaling back her work to accompany him on business trips, then giving up her position entirely when his schedule grew too demanding. Each step had seemed reasonable, a small sacrifice for their partnership. Now, 12 years later, she found herself alone in a palace of their making, scrolling through fertility forums while Thaddeus built his empire, an empire that increasingly seemed to exclude her. She opened the medicine cabinet and stared at the array of hormone injections and supplements. Their 3rd round of IVF had failed spectacularly. Then, miraculously, she'd conceived naturally, only to lose the baby just as they'd begun to celebrate. Thaddeus had been away when she started bleeding. In New York, he'd said. A client emergency. He'd returned the next day, hand holding hers in the hospital, his face a mask of appropriate concern. But something had been off, a distance in his eyes, a subtle detachment she couldn't quite name. Eleanor closed the cabinet and returned to her study. On her desk sat a business card she'd been staring at for days. Miles Lancaster, private investigator. A friend had recommended him, whispering his name over lunch with a knowing look. "Just in case," she'd said. "Every wife in your position should have someone like him." Eleanor had dismissed the suggestion initially, but then came the late nights, the business trips with vague itineraries, the cologne she didn't recognize. Small things, things that could be explained away. But combined with the growing coldness between them, the subtle critiques, the way Thaddeus had begun to look at her as if she were a disappointing investment rather than a wife. Her hand hovered over the card. Then, with sudden decisiveness, she picked up her phone and dialed. Thaddeus straightened his cufflinks as he rode the private elevator to the lobby. The subtle weight of the platinum against his wrists centered him, reminded him of his position. He was Thaddeus Morissette. He took what he wanted, and tonight what he wanted was to celebrate with Vega, to revel in the life growing inside her, the life that Eleanor had failed to give him. "Take the night off," he'd told his driver earlier. "I'll walk. It's just across the plaza." The doors opened to the marble grandeur of the lobby. Vega waited by the fountain, the emerald dress highlighting her eyes and elegantly accommodating her pregnancy. Her dark hair fell in waves over her shoulders, and she wore the diamond earrings he'd given her last month, small enough to be tasteful, expensive enough to be worthy of her. "You look magnificent," he said, kissing her cheek and placing his hand possessively on the small of her back. "Are you sure about this?" Vega asked, glancing around the lobby. "Altitude is in your building. People will see us." Thaddeus smiled, the smile that closed billion-dollar deals. "Let them see. I'm tired of hiding what makes me happy." What he didn't say was how much he enjoyed the risk, the possibility that word might get back to Eleanor. Maybe it would finally shake her out of the fog she'd been living in, force her to recognize that life moved on, with or without her participation. As they crossed the lobby toward the dedicated elevator that would take them to altitude, the restaurant occupying the top 3 floors of the adjacent tower, Thaddeus felt a presence behind him. "Mr. Morissette." The voice was measured, authoritative. Thaddeus turned to see a tall man in his 50s, wearing an impeccably tailored grey suit that almost matched his penetrating eyes. There was something unsettling about his stillness, the way he stood without shifting his weight or fidgeting. "Do I know you?" Thaddeus asked, instinctively stepping slightly in front of Vega. "No," the man said, "but I know you quite well. My name is Garrett Holloway." The name meant nothing to Thaddeus, but something in Holloway's expression, a cold certainty, made his skin prickle. "I'm afraid I'm on my way to dinner," Thaddeus said, gesturing toward the restaurant elevator. "Whatever this is about, you can make an appointment with my office." "This can't wait," Holloway replied, his gaze shifting briefly to Vega's pregnant form before returning to Thaddeus. "It concerns your wife, and certain choices you've made." Thaddeus felt a flicker of unease. "Excuse me? Perhaps you'd prefer a more private conversation," Holloway suggested, his eyes again moving meaningfully to Vega. Vega tightened her grip on Thaddeus's arm. "Who is this man, Thad?" Thaddeus hesitated, his mind racing through possibilities. A journalist? A blackmailer? Someone sent by a competitor? "Go ahead to the restaurant," he told Vega. "I'll join you shortly. Our usual table." Vega looked uncertainly between the 2 men before nodding and walking toward the elevator. As she moved away, she cast one last glance over her shoulder, her expression troubled. Holloway waited until she was gone before speaking again. "I've been watching you for a very long time, Mr. Morissette." "Is that supposed to intimidate me?" Thaddeus challenged, though he felt a creeping discomfort. "No," Holloway said, opening the leather portfolio he carried. "This is." He withdrew a photograph and handed it to Thaddeus. In it, Eleanor sat in a coffee shop Thaddeus didn't recognize, deep in conversation with a man he'd never seen before. "Your wife hired a private investigator 3 months ago," Holloway explained. "Miles Lancaster. Very thorough, very discreet. But he doesn't know that I've been monitoring you much longer, and for very different reasons." "What the hell are you talking about? Who are you?" Thaddeus demanded, his composure slipping. Holloway's expression remained impassive. "I'm the brother of Rebecca Holloway." The name hit Thaddeus like an electric shock. Rebecca Holloway, the brilliant young executive who'd worked for him 7 years ago, the one who'd become his mistress during a particularly rocky period in his marriage, the one who'd gotten pregnant, the one he'd forced out of the company, pressured to terminate the pregnancy, and then abandoned, the one who'd killed herself 2 weeks later. "That's impossible," Thaddeus whispered, blood draining from his face. "There's no way you could know about how you systematically destroyed my sister," Holloway asked, his voice finally revealing a hint of emotion, a cold rage that had clearly been cultivated for years. "About how you're now repeating the same pattern with your pregnant mistress, while your wife recovers from a miscarriage that you may have played a role in." Thaddeus felt as if the ground were shifting beneath his feet. "What do you want? Money?" "I want justice," Holloway answered simply. He handed Thaddeus more documents from his portfolio. "These are copies of everything I've given to Eleanor this morning. Bank transfers to offshore accounts. Emails between you and Vega dating back 14 months. Medical records showing you replaced your wife's fertility medications with placebos while publicly blaming her for your childlessness." "You're insane," Thaddeus sputtered, though panic was rising in his chest. "These are fabrications, lies. The SEC, the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, and your board of directors received copies as well," Holloway continued as if Thaddeus hadn't spoken. "They'll determine what's true." Thaddeus's phone vibrated in his pocket. With shaking hands, he pulled it out to find a text message from Eleanor. Don't come home tonight. Your things will be in the lobby tomorrow. My lawyers will contact you. As the implications crashed over him, Holloway placed one final document in Thaddeus's hands, a formal summons. "This is just the beginning, Mr. Morissette," Holloway said, his voice now softer but no less menacing. "7 years ago, you took everything from Rebecca. Now it's time for you to understand how that feels." With that, Holloway turned and walked calmly toward the exit, leaving Thaddeus standing frozen in the middle of the lobby, his carefully constructed world beginning to fracture like ice beneath his feet. In the restaurant upstairs, Vega's phone chimed with a news alert. The headline made her stomach lurch. "Morissette Investments CEO under federal investigation for fraud and market manipulation." Below was a photo of her and Thaddeus leaving his office building, his hand proprietary on her waist, her pregnancy clearly visible. And in the penthouse above them all, Eleanor Morissette closed her laptop, having just sent emails to their family lawyer, her parents, and the board members she knew personally. Beside her sat the private investigator, Miles Lancaster, and a thick folder containing evidence of a betrayal so complete, so calculated, that it had left her breathless when she first saw it. "Are you sure about this?" Miles asked gently. "Once we move forward, there's no going back." Eleanor looked at the ultrasound photo she'd kept as a memento of the baby she'd lost. Then her eyes moved to the documents, proving that Thaddeus had been tampering with her medications for years, ensuring she couldn't carry his child, while he pursued other women who could. "I've never been more certain of anything," she replied, her voice finding strength for the first time in months. "He took everything from me. Now I'm going to return the favor." Thaddeus stood motionless in the marble lobby, the documents trembling slightly in his hands. People passed around him, residents, visitors, staff, but he barely registered their presence. 7 years. Garrett Holloway had been watching him for 7 years, meticulously documenting every questionable business decision, every personal transgression, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Rebecca Holloway's face flashed in his memory, bright, ambitious, so much like Vega in many ways. He had compartmentalized that incident so thoroughly, he'd almost convinced himself it never happened. Almost. His phone vibrated again. Another text from Eleanor. "The security code has been changed. Don't try to come up." Then a message from his executive assistant. "Mr. Morissette, the board is calling an emergency meeting tomorrow at 8 a.m. Please confirm your attendance." Thaddeus loosened his tie, suddenly feeling as if he couldn't breathe. He scanned the documents in his hands. Bank statements showing suspicious transfers, email exchanges with offshore entities, surveillance photos of him and Vega entering hotels. But what stopped his heart was a laboratory analysis of Eleanor's fertility medications, showing conclusively that they had been replaced with inactive substances. "Impossible," he whispered. He'd been careful, so careful, using Eleanor's prescription information to order placebos from an overseas pharmacy. Switching the medications himself, always when she was out. There couldn't possibly be evidence unless someone had been watching him all along. Thaddeus felt the weight of eyes on him and looked up sharply. Across the lobby, a security guard was studying him with newfound scrutiny, speaking quietly into his radio. Word was already spreading. He needed to think, to plan. Damage control was his specialty. He'd buried scandals for clients, restructured failing portfolios, manipulated markets when necessary. This was just another crisis to manage. But as he moved toward the elevators, his legs unsteady beneath him, Thaddeus knew this was different. This was personal. This was revenge. Upstairs at altitude, Vega stared at her phone in disbelief. The article detailed allegations of fraud, insider trading and misappropriation of client funds at Morissette Investments. There was even mention of a workplace relationship with a junior employee, now pregnant with what sources claim is Morissette's child. Her hand instinctively moved to protect her stomach as she felt the stares of nearby diners. The hostess approached hesitantly. "Ms. Morello? There's a call for you at the front desk." Vega followed her to the reception area, aware of the whispers trailing behind her. The hostess handed her a phone. "Vega, it's Julian." The voice of Morissette Investments' chief compliance officer was tight with strain. "Where are you?" "I'm at altitude waiting for Thaddeus," she replied, turning away from curious onlookers. "Listen to me very carefully," Julian said. "The FBI is currently at our offices. They're seizing files and electronic records. The SEC has frozen certain company accounts. Do not, I repeat, do not, speak to Thaddeus about any client matters. If he asks you to access any systems or files, refuse. Julian, what's happening? She asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. The dam has broken, Vega, and you need to decide right now which side of the flood you want to be on. He paused. And given your personal situation, you might want to consider cooperating for your child's sake. The line went dead. Vega stood frozen, clutching the phone as her world tilted on its axis. She'd always known Thaddeus operated in grey areas. She'd even participated in some questionable transactions, telling herself it was just how business was done at the highest levels. But federal investigations, seized records, this wasn't a grey area, this was an abyss. A notification on her phone caught her attention, an email from G. Holloway with the subject line, "What you don't know about Thaddeus Morissette." Attached was a PDF file. Her finger hovered over it. Opening this could change everything. But wasn't everything already changing? She tapped the attachment. In Miles Lancaster's modest office in Lincoln Park, Eleanor sat surrounded by evidence of her husband's betrayal. The veteran private investigator had converted a conference room into what he called the Situation Room, with timelines, photographs, and documents covering the walls. "I've worked hundreds of cases involving unfaithful spouses," Miles said, pouring her a cup of tea, "but I've never seen anything like this. This level of calculation, of cruelty." Eleanor studied a chart showing the timeline of her fertility treatments, cross-referenced with Thaddeus's secret pharmacy orders. For 3 years he had been systematically ensuring she couldn't conceive while publicly supporting their efforts to start a family. "Was I really so blind?" she asked, her voice hollow. Miles sat across from her, his weathered face compassionate. At 62 he'd seen the worst of human behavior, but even he had been shaken by what they'd uncovered. "Manipulators like your husband are experts at deception," he said gently. "They create a reality that serves their purposes." Eleanor touched a photograph of herself from 5 years ago, smiling, vibrant, standing confidently beside Thaddeus at a gallery opening. "I used to be strong," she murmured. "I used to trust my instincts." "You still are strong," said a voice from the doorway. Garrett Holloway entered, removing his coat. "Strong enough to take action when you finally saw the truth." Eleanor studied the man who had approached her 3 weeks ago with an outlandish story about his sister and evidence of Thaddeus's ongoing deceptions. Initially she'd dismissed him, but something in his quiet intensity had convinced her to listen. "Did you see him?" she asked. Garrett nodded. "He received the documents and the summons." "How did he react?" A flicker of satisfaction crossed Garrett's otherwise composed features. "Like a man watching his empire crumble beneath him." Miles cleared his throat. "Mrs. Morissette, Eleanor, we need to discuss next steps. With the federal investigations now underway, things will move quickly. Reporters will start calling. The board will distance themselves from Thaddeus, and he will fight back." "I know my husband," Eleanor said, straightening her shoulders. "His first instinct will be to try to control the narrative, to paint me as unstable, vindictive, possibly even delusional after losing the baby." "Which is why we need to move first," Garrett said, placing his portfolio on the table. "I've spent 7 years building this case. Every document is authenticated. Every allegation is supported by evidence, but timing is crucial." Eleanor rose and walked to the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline. Somewhere out there, Thaddeus was scrambling, plotting, trying to find a way to escape the consequences of his actions, as he always had. "You said your sister was pregnant," she said to Garrett, still facing the window, "when Thaddeus pressured her to terminate." "Yes." She turned to face him. "And you believe he did the same with other women?" "Before me." Garrett exchanged a glance with Miles. "We've identified 3 cases where Thaddeus had affairs with employees who subsequently left the company. 2 of them moved out of state. 1 refused to speak with us." Eleanor absorbed this, her face betraying nothing. Then she walked to the table where a particular document lay, a medical analysis of her miscarriage at 12 weeks. "The doctor said it could have been caused by stress," she said quietly, "but also possibly by medication interactions or hormonal disruptions." "Exactly what would happen if your actual prescribed medications were suddenly replaced with placebos," Miles confirmed. "The sudden hormonal shift could have been enough to—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Eleanor traced her finger over the medical report, then looked up at both men, her eyes now clear and focused. "I want everything," she said, her voice steady. "I want the company. I want the penthouse. I want his reputation. I want the world to know exactly who Thaddeus Morissette is." Garrett's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or vindication. "Then we need to move faster than he can. The moment he realizes the extent of what we have, he'll start hiding assets, calling in favors, and building his defense." "He's already started," Miles said, holding up his phone. "My contact at the Chicago Tribune says Thaddeus's PR team is pushing a story about you having mental health issues following the miscarriage. They're suggesting you've become paranoid, imagining conspiracies." Eleanor laughed bitterly. "Conspiracies? I spent 3 years blaming myself for not being able to conceive. I injected myself with hormones, underwent painful procedures, tracked my temperature every morning, all while he was ensuring it would never happen." Her voice hardened. "That's not paranoia, that's the truth." She returned to the table and picked up a pen. "What do I need to sign?" Miles pushed several documents toward her. "Divorce filing, requests for emergency injunctions freezing your joint assets, authorization for us to provide evidence to federal investigators." As Eleanor signed each paper with a firm hand, Garrett watched her transformation. The fragile, uncertain woman he'd first approached was gone. In her place was someone reminiscent of his sister, before Thaddeus had broken her. Determined, clear-eyed, unstoppable. "There's one more thing you should know," Garrett said as she finished signing. "About Vega Morello." Thaddeus paced the length of his attorney's office, his tie discarded, his collar unbuttoned. "This is a coordinated attack, Richard. We need to hit back hard and fast." Richard Keller, who had represented Morissette Investments for 15 years, looked up from the documents spread across his desk. His normally impassive legal expression had given way to genuine concern. "Thaddeus, you need to listen very carefully. This isn't a simple PR problem. These are serious federal allegations backed by substantial evidence. The board has already called an emergency meeting without you. Half your executive team isn't returning calls. And Eleanor's divorce filing includes details that no one wants made public. She's emotional, unstable. She lost a baby, for God's sake," Thaddeus countered, pouring himself a third scotch from Richard's bar. "We'll get a sympathetic judge, a gag order." "Thaddeus," Richard's voice cut through his client's rationalizations. "The FBI has your encrypted communications with the Cayman accounts. The SEC has documentation of client fund misappropriation. And your wife has proof that you deliberately sabotaged her fertility treatments while carrying on an affair with a pregnant employee." He removed his glasses, suddenly looking older than his 60 years. "This isn't going away with a press release and a donation to the right charity." Thaddeus sank into a chair, the reality of his situation finally beginning to penetrate his wall of denial. "Holloway," he muttered. "This is all because of him, because of his sister." "Rebecca Holloway, your former employee?" Richard frowned. "What does she have to do with this?" Thaddeus waved his hand dismissively. "Ancient history. She worked for me years ago. We had an affair, she got pregnant. Things ended badly. She took her own life." Richard stared at him. "And her brother has been building a case against you ever since." "Apparently." The lawyer closed his eyes briefly, as if seeking patience. "So this isn't just about financial impropriety or marital infidelity. This is a vendetta by someone who believes you drove his sister to suicide. And now he's allied himself with your wife." Thaddeus drained his glass. "Find something on Holloway. Everyone has skeletons, dig them up." Richard sighed. "Thaddeus, there's something else. The judge granted Eleanor's request for an emergency freeze on all your joint assets. Your accounts, properties, everything. Until the divorce proceedings clarify what's yours and what's hers, you can't access any of it." "What?" Thaddeus stood abruptly. "That's absurd. The penthouse is in my name." "It's in both your names, as is the house in Lake Forest, the property in Aspen, and the villa in Tuscany." Richard checked his notes. "Your personal checking account remains accessible, but your investment accounts are temporarily frozen." Thaddeus pulled out his phone and opened his banking app. His personal account showed a balance of $42,873.15, a pittance by his standards, barely enough for a week at a decent hotel. "This can't be happening," he muttered, more to himself than to Richard. He looked up sharply. Call Judge Hemming. He owes me after that fundraiser last year. Richard shook his head. Judge Hemming recused himself immediately when your case came up. He cited potential conflict of interest due to his past attendance at Morissette investment events. Thaddeus began pacing again, his mind racing. He still had contacts, influence, options. This was a setback, not defeat. He'd rebuilt before, after the 2008 crash, when everyone said he was finished. He would do it again. His phone buzzed with another text. This one from Vega. I just got a call from the FBI. They want me to come in tomorrow for questioning. What have you done, Thaddeus? Before he could respond, a breaking news alert appeared. Breaking: Morissette Investments CEO accused of fraud, market manipulation, and psychological abuse of wife. Richard cleared his throat. Thaddeus, as your legal counsel, I have to advise you not to contact Vega Morello. Any communication could be construed as witness tampering at this point. Witness? Thaddeus looked up, incredulous. She's carrying my child. Richard's expression grew even more grave. That complicates things further. Given the allegations about your tampering with Eleanor's medications, your relationship with Ms. Morello could be seen as particularly damaging. The full weight of his situation was finally sinking in. Thaddeus Morissette, financial wizard, Chicago power broker, master of his universe, was watching everything slip through his fingers. His phone rang. Unknown number. Don't answer that, Richard warned. But Thaddeus, always certain he knew better, swiped to accept the call. Thaddeus Morissette. Mr. Morissette, this is Special Agent Keisha Washington with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. We'd like you to come in tomorrow morning to answer some questions about certain transactions at Morissette Investments. Thaddeus met Richard's eyes, watching his attorney's expression shift from concern to resignation. My attorney will contact your office to arrange a suitable time, Thaddeus replied, fighting to keep his voice steady. We'll expect your call by 9 a.m., the agent responded. In the meantime, I should inform you that the court has approved our request to restrict your travel. Please don't leave the Chicago metropolitan area. The line went dead. Thaddeus lowered the phone slowly. They're restricting my movements, like I'm some kind of criminal. Richard began gathering the documents on his desk. I'll clear my schedule for the next week. We need to prepare for your FBI interview. And the SEC will want to speak with you as well. Plus, there's the emergency board meeting in the morning. They can't remove me, Thaddeus said automatically. I'm the majority shareholder. You were, Richard corrected. But with the shares held in joint accounts with Eleanor now frozen, he let the implication hang in the air. Thaddeus felt the room spinning around him. How had everything unraveled so quickly? Just hours ago he'd been standing in his penthouse, master of all he surveyed. Now he couldn't even go home. His phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from Eleanor, with no subject line. The message contained only an attachment, a video file. Against Richard's protests, Thaddeus opened it. The footage showed him in their bedroom, carefully opening Eleanor's prescription bottles, emptying the contents, and replacing them with identical-looking pills from unmarked containers. Jesus Christ, Richard whispered, looking over Thaddeus's shoulder. They had cameras in your bedroom? Thaddeus couldn't speak. The timestamp on the video was from 8 months ago, during their second round of IVF treatments. Another text appeared below the video. I have everything, Thaddeus. Every lie. Every betrayal. Every moment you thought no one was watching. And now so does everyone else. In a small cafe near Millennium Park, Eleanor sat across from Miles and Garrett, watching the sun set over the Chicago skyline. She looked different already. Her posture straighter, her eyes clearer, her voice stronger. He's received everything, she asked, sipping her tea. Everything, Garrett confirmed. The divorce filing, the asset freeze, the evidence we've compiled, and the video. The FBI has officially opened an investigation, Miles added. They're moving quickly, likely because of the potential size of the financial crimes. They've already interviewed 3 of Morissette Investments' former employees. Eleanor nodded, processing this information. And Vega Morello? She received the file I sent her, Garrett said. It included documentation of Thaddeus's pattern with women who become pregnant, Rebecca's story, the others we know about, and of course what he did to you. Do you think she'll cooperate? She's ambitious, not stupid, Miles replied. Facing a choice between going down with Thaddeus or saving herself, she'll choose self-preservation. Eleanor set down her cup with deliberate care. What about the paternity test? Should we tell her? Garrett and Miles exchanged glances. "Not yet," Garrett said after a moment. "That information is valuable. We should hold it until we see how things develop." Eleanor looked out at the darkening sky, the city lights beginning to illuminate the encroaching night. For years she had been living in a beautiful prison, her walls built from Thaddeus's lies and her own diminishing self-worth. Now those walls were crumbling, revealing a truth that was painful but oddly liberating. 7 years, she said, turning back to Garrett. "You waited 7 years for this moment." His expression remained composed, but his eyes revealed the depth of his commitment. "Rebecca deserved justice. She was brilliant, kind, full of life until she met your husband. After she died, I made a promise to expose who he really is." "And now?" Eleanor asked. "Once this is done?" Garrett considered the question. "I've dedicated my life to this pursuit for so long, I'm not sure what comes after." Eleanor reached across the table and touched his hand briefly, a simple human connection that seemed to surprise them both. "After this," she said with quiet determination, "we make sure it never happens to anyone else." The Morissette Investments headquarters occupied 5 floors of a sleek glass tower in Chicago's financial district. For 15 years, it had been Thaddeus's fortress, a testament to his vision and power. Now, as he approached the building the morning after his world had begun to crumble, he saw it through new eyes, as a potential crime scene. FBI agents stood in the lobby, checking IDs and escorting employees to designated interview rooms. News vans lined the street outside. A photographer snapped Thaddeus's picture as he pushed through the revolving doors, his attorney Richard at his side. "Mr. Morissette, did you systematically defraud your clients?" shouted a reporter. "Is it true your wife is filing for divorce due to your affair with a pregnant employee?" called another. Thaddeus kept his eyes forward, jaw clenched, as security guards cleared a path to the elevators. His executive assistant waited there, her usual composed demeanor replaced by barely concealed anxiety. "The board is already in session," she whispered. "They've been meeting since 6 a.m. "Without me?" Thaddeus snapped. "I'm the CEO. They can't hold a formal meeting without—" "It's not a formal board meeting," Richard interrupted quietly. "It's an emergency session of the independent directors. They're within their rights." The elevator doors closed, sealing them in oppressive silence. Thaddeus checked his reflection in the mirrored wall, same tailored suit, same confident posture, but his eyes betrayed him, hollow with shock and lack of sleep. When the doors opened on the executive floor, Thaddeus found his path to the boardroom blocked by Diane Chen, the chief risk officer, and the board's most independent voice. "Thaddeus," she said, her expression professionally neutral, "the board has asked me to inform you that your access to company systems has been temporarily suspended pending the investigation. Your executive privileges are on hold, and you've been placed on administrative leave effective immediately." Thaddeus stared at her, incredulous. "You can't be serious. This company exists because of me. I built it from nothing." "The allegations are extremely serious," Diane continued, unruffled. "Client funds misappropriated, regulatory violations, personal misconduct affecting the company's reputation." She handed him an envelope. "This outlines the terms of your administrative leave and the interim leadership structure." Thaddeus tore open the envelope. Inside was a single page listing Julian Ashford, the Chief Compliance Officer, as acting CEO. "Julian?" he sputtered. "My own compliance officer, precisely because he's been raising concerns about certain transactions for the past 18 months, Diane replied. "Concerns you repeatedly dismissed." Behind her, the boardroom door opened. Inside, Thaddeus could see the grim faces of board members he'd personally selected, people who owed their positions, their wealth, their status to him. None would meet his eye. "This is insanity," he said, his voice rising. "A temporary media circus whipped up by my emotionally unstable wife and some lunatic with a vendetta." Diane's professional veneer cracked slightly. "Thaddeus, I've seen the evidence. We all have. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is years of deliberate misconduct, both professional and personal." She lowered her voice. "The tampering with your wife's medications. How could you do something so cruel?" Before Thaddeus could respond, elevator doors opened behind them. 2 FBI agents stepped out, accompanied by the head of building security. "Mr. Morissette," one agent said, "we're here to escort you to your office while you collect personal belongings. After that, we'd like you to accompany us to our field office for questioning." Thaddeus looked to Richard, who nodded grimly. This was really happening, As the agents led him down the hallway to his corner office, employees watched from behind glass walls, their expressions a mix of shock, curiosity, and in some cases, barely concealed satisfaction. Inside his office, Thaddeus found more agents already there, boxing files and imaging his computer. "This is a fishing expedition," he protested as an agent watched him empty his desk drawers. "You won't find anything because there's nothing to find." The agent merely nodded, her expression professionally blank. "Please limit yourself to personal items only, sir." Thaddeus pulled open his bottom drawer and reached for a framed photo, him and Eleanor on their wedding day, her face radiant with love and trust. He hesitated, then left it in the drawer. As he gathered the few items he actually cared about, a rare fountain pen, a small sculpture from a grateful client, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was a Chicago area code he didn't recognize. "Don't answer that," Richard warned, but Thaddeus, never one to follow advice that contradicted his impulses, accepted the call. "Thaddeus Morissette. Mr. Morissette, this is Dr. Landry from Chicago Memorial's Department of Reproductive Medicine. I'm calling because your wife has authorized us to share her medical records with investigators. Before those records are released, I wanted to inform you directly that our lab analysis identified the substances that were substituted for Mrs. Morissette's prescribed medications." Thaddeus's blood ran cold. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The substitutions began approximately 3 years ago," the doctor continued, as if Thaddeus hadn't spoken. "The placebo pills contained harmless but inactive ingredients designed to mimic the appearance of the prescribed hormones. This systematic replacement would have effectively nullified all of our fertility treatments." Thaddeus ended the call, his hand shaking. Everyone was watching him, the agents, Richard, even his assistant hovering anxiously in the doorway. "Time to go, Mr. Morissette," said one of the agents, closing the box of Thaddeus's belongings. As they escorted him out of the office he'd occupied for 15 years, Thaddeus felt the weight of eyes following him. The same employees who had once scrambled to please him, now watching his humiliation with undisguised interest. His empire was crumbling brick by brick, and he was powerless to stop it. Across town, in the elegant Lincoln Park townhouse that had once belonged to her grandmother, Eleanor sat in what had become the war room of her campaign against Thaddeus. Maps, timelines, and documents covered the walls. A team of forensic accountants worked at a table in the corner, while Miles Lancaster coordinated with investigators by phone. "The judge granted our motion for expedited discovery," announced Caroline Wells, Eleanor's divorce attorney, entering the room with a triumphant smile. Thaddeus's attorneys tried to argue for a gag order and sealing of all records, but the judge denied both requests. Eleanor nodded. A small victory, but significant. "And the financial forensics. We've identified 3 offshore accounts not included in the asset disclosure Thaddeus provided last year," replied one of the accountants. "Approximately $18 million, hidden in a structured investment vehicle in the Caymans." "Add it to the list," Eleanor directed. She turned to Garrett, who sat reviewing surveillance reports. "Any movement on the personal front?" "He spent last night at the Peninsula Hotel," Garrett replied. "This morning he went directly to his office where FBI agents were waiting. He's currently being questioned at the Federal Building." Eleanor absorbed this information with a calmness that surprised even her. For years, she had subordinated her needs to Thaddeus's, diminished her voice to amplify his. Now she was orchestrating his downfall with a clarity and purpose that felt almost transcendent. "Ms. Morello's lawyer called again," Miles announced, covering his phone's microphone. "She's prepared to provide testimony about certain financial irregularities she witnessed in exchange for immunity from prosecution." "Immunity?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "How involved was she?" According to her lawyer, Thaddeus had her execute several questionable transactions. "She has documentation that could be extremely damaging to him." Eleanor considered this. "Tell her lawyer we'll support an immunity deal if her testimony is thorough and truthful, including details of their personal relationship." As Miles returned to his call, Caroline approached Eleanor with a concerned expression. "There's something else you should know. Thaddeus's team is building a counter-narrative. They're suggesting you've become mentally unstable following the miscarriage, possibly even delusional. They've subpoenaed your therapist, Dr. Winters." Eleanor felt a flash of betrayal. "She helped me through the darkest period of my life. She can't disclose the content of your sessions without your consent," Caroline assured her. "But they're trying to create doubt about your mental state. It's a classic tactic. Discredit the accuser. Eleanor nodded, unsurprised by Thaddeus's strategy. He always attacks when cornered. It's reflexive. There's more, Caroline continued hesitantly. They're suggesting your miscarriage wasn't caused by stress or medication tampering, but by lifestyle choices. Lifestyle choices, Eleanor repeated incredulously. They're implying you were drinking during your pregnancy. They've got statements from waitstaff at several restaurants. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. That's impossible. I didn't drink a drop after we confirmed the pregnancy. Thaddeus knows that. He does, Garrett interjected, his voice hard. Which is why he's having people lie. It's the same playbook he used with Rebecca. Undermine credibility. Create alternative explanations. Shift blame to the victim. Eleanor stood abruptly, walking to the window. Outside, spring was bringing Lincoln Park back to life. Trees budding, flowers emerging. Renewal after the dead of winter. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, gathering her resolve. We anticipated he would fight dirty, she said, turning back to her team. So we fight smarter. She looked at Garrett. It's time to release the medical evidence. All of it. Including the pharmacy records showing Thaddeus ordering the placebos. Garrett nodded grimly. It's ready to go. And contact Vega Morello directly, Eleanor added. Not through her lawyer. I want to meet with her, woman to woman. In a sparse interview room at the FBI's Chicago field office, Thaddeus sat across from Special Agent Keisha Washington and her partner, Agent David Mercer. For 2 hours, they had methodically walked him through a series of transactions that, when laid out chronologically, painted a damning picture of financial manipulation. So, to summarize, Mr. Morissette, Agent Washington said, her voice precise and unemotional, client funds were routinely diverted to the Wellington Capital account, then transferred to SCG Holdings in the Caymans, before being routed back to your personal trading account at Garrison Lynch. All without client knowledge or consent. Those were bridge loans, Thaddeus insisted. Temporary liquidity management for clients who needed immediate capital deployment. Without disclosure? Without documentation? Agent Mercer asked skeptically. The paperwork was handled internally, asked Julian Ashford. We did, Washington replied, sliding a document across the table. This is Mr. Ashford's sworn statement, indicating he raised concerns about these transactions on multiple occasions, only to be overruled by you personally. Thaddeus felt sweat beading at his hairline. Julian had always been a stickler for rules, but Thaddeus never imagined he'd been documenting his objections. My client has cooperated fully for over 2 hours, Richard interjected. Unless you're charging him with something specific, we'd like to conclude this interview. Agent Washington gathered her files unhurriedly. We're just getting started, Mr. Keller. The financial irregularities are only one aspect of our investigation. What other aspects? Thaddeus demanded. Wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy, obstruction. Washington counted off on her fingers. And we haven't even touched on the manipulation of pharmaceutical prescriptions, which could add charges of obtaining controlled substances through deception. This is absurd, Thaddeus sputtered. I'm being railroaded because my wife is having a mental breakdown and found allies with grudges against me. Washington's expression didn't change. Mr. Morissette, your wife's mental health isn't relevant to the $42 million in client funds that were improperly diverted through offshore entities. Nor does it explain why you ordered placebo medications from an overseas pharmacy using false credentials. She stood to leave. You're free to go for now, but don't leave Chicago. We'll be in touch very soon. As they walked out of the federal building, Richard spoke in a low, urgent tone. Thaddeus, you need to seriously consider a plea arrangement. They have documentary evidence, financial records, witness testimonies. I'm not pleading to anything, Thaddeus snapped. This witch hunt will collapse under its own weight. I just need time to organize a counteroffensive. Richard stopped walking, forcing Thaddeus to face him. Listen to me. Your company has disavowed you. Your assets are frozen. Federal agencies are building a case that could send you to prison for decades, and your wife has evidence of personal misconduct that would turn any jury against you. This isn't a fight you can win through sheer force of will. Thaddeus stared at his attorney, a man who had always found legal pathways for whatever Thaddeus wanted to accomplish. Now Richard was telling him to surrender. I still have resources, Thaddeus said stubbornly. Contacts, leverage. What leverage? Richard asked, exasperated. Eleanor has the evidence. The feds have your financial records. Your board has abandoned you. Thaddeus's phone buzzed with a news alert. The headline made his stomach lurch. Morissette scandal deepens. Evidence reveals systematic sabotage of wife's fertility treatments. The accompanying photo was a split screen. On one side, Eleanor in a hospital gown during an IVF procedure. On the other, pharmacy records showing Thaddeus ordering placebo medications under a false name. Jesus, Richard muttered, looking over Thaddeus's shoulder. They're going public with everything. Thaddeus scrolled frantically through the article. It detailed how he had systematically replaced Eleanor's prescribed fertility medications with placebos for years, all while publicly supporting their efforts to conceive and privately blaming her for their failure to have children. The article quoted Dr. Samantha Winters, Eleanor's therapist. Mrs. Morissette suffered profound psychological trauma as a result of believing her body was failing her, when in fact her treatments were being deliberately sabotaged by the person she trusted most. Dr. Winters breached confidentiality? Thaddeus asked, incredulous. That's grounds for a lawsuit, a medical ethics complaint. Eleanor waived confidentiality, Richard explained wearily. She's controlling the narrative, Thaddeus. And it's a narrative that makes you look like a monster. As if to confirm this assessment, Thaddeus's phone rang with a call from an unlisted number. Against Richard's advice, he answered. You've seen the article, said Garrett Holloway without preamble. That's just the beginning. By this time tomorrow, everyone will know exactly who you are and what you've done. Not just to Eleanor, but to Rebecca. And others. You son of a bitch, Thaddeus growled. You've orchestrated this whole thing. No, Thaddeus, you orchestrated it. With every lie, every manipulation, every person you used and discarded. I just documented it. The call ended. Thaddeus stood on the steps of the Federal Building, surrounded by the city he'd once dominated, feeling more alone than he ever had in his life. The lakefront cafe was quiet in the late afternoon, its patio offering views of Lake Michigan and privacy for its patrons. Vega Morello sat at a corner table, one hand protectively covering her stomach, the other clutching her phone. She wore oversized sunglasses despite the cloudy day, a futile attempt at anonymity in a city now buzzing with her name. When Eleanor Morissette approached the table, Vega tensed visibly. She'd expected anger, accusations, perhaps even a scene. What she hadn't expected was Eleanor's calm, almost serene demeanor as she took the seat across from her. Thank you for meeting me, Eleanor said simply. Vega removed her sunglasses, revealing eyes red from crying. I didn't think I had much choice. Your investigator was persuasive. Miles can be intense, Eleanor acknowledged, but this meeting was my idea, not his. A waiter approached, and Eleanor ordered tea for both of them, as if this were a normal social occasion between friends. Why am I here? Vega asked when they were alone again. To gloat? To threaten me? Neither. Eleanor studied the younger woman thoughtfully. I wanted to meet the person Thaddeus chose as my replacement. Vega flinched. I never saw myself as your replacement. No? What did you see yourself as then? The question hung in the air, forcing Vega to confront her own rationalizations. I told myself it was different, that what we had was special. She laughed bitterly. God, it sounds so pathetic saying it out loud. It's not pathetic, Eleanor replied quietly. It's human. Thaddeus has a gift for making people feel special, chosen. It's how he gets them to do what he wants. The waiter returned with their tea. As Eleanor prepared hers with practiced grace, Vega watched her with a mixture of wariness and curiosity. I've been cooperating with the FBI, Vega said abruptly, about the financial operations, things he had me do that didn't seem right. I know, Miles told me. Then what do you want from me? Eleanor set down her cup. Information of a different kind, about you and Thaddeus, how it began, what he promised you, whether this child was... She hesitated. Planned, Vega finished. No. It was an accident. But when I told him, he seemed pleased, proud even. He said it was meant to be. Eleanor absorbed this with remarkable composure. And did he tell you about our fertility struggles? He said you'd been trying for years, that doctors couldn't explain why it wasn't working. Vega looked down, unable to meet Eleanor's gaze. He never mentioned that he was sabotaging your treatments. Would it have mattered if you'd known? The question wasn't accusatory, but genuinely curious. Vega considered it honestly. I don't know, she admitted. By the time I found out I was pregnant, I was already in deep. With the affair, With certain financial transactions I shouldn't have authorized, he had me compromised professionally and personally. Eleanor nodded, understanding. That's his pattern. Create complicity. Ensure silence through shared guilt. I never wanted to hurt you, Vega said suddenly. That sounds ridiculous, I know. Having an affair with your husband while you were going through all that. She shook her head. But it's true. When I saw that article today about the medications, I felt physically ill. Because it made you see him differently? Because it made me see myself differently. What kind of person gets involved with a man who would do something so cruel? What does that say about me? Eleanor's expression softened slightly. It says you're human, and that you encountered a predator skilled at identifying vulnerabilities. She reached into her purse and withdrew an envelope. There's something else you should know, something Garrett Holloway discovered during his investigation. Vega took the envelope with trepidation. What is this? Medical records from Chicago Memorial where you've been receiving prenatal care, specifically genetic screening results. Vega frowned. I haven't received any genetic screening results yet. My next appointment isn't until... Thaddeus obtained them secretly, Eleanor explained. He has a contact in the hospital's administration. He's been monitoring your medical records since you confirmed the pregnancy. With unsteady hands, Vega opened the envelope and scanned the documents inside. Her face paled as she read. This can't be right, she whispered. The paternity exclusion is definitive, Eleanor said gently. Thaddeus is not the father of your child. Vega stared at the test results, her world tilting on its axis for the second time in 24 hours. But how? Who? According to Garrett's investigation, you were seeing someone else briefly before your relationship with Thaddeus became exclusive. A colleague at Morissette Investments. Julian, Vega murmured, the realization dawning. Julian Ashford. We had a brief thing, just a few weeks right before Thaddeus and I... Eleanor nodded. The timing aligns with your conception date. Does Thaddeus know? Not yet, but he will, once these records are submitted in the divorce proceedings. Vega's hand went to her stomach, her expression a complex mixture of emotions. Shock, confusion, and something that might have been relief. Why are you telling me this? Why not blindside me in court along with Thaddeus? Eleanor regarded her thoughtfully. Because despite everything, I don't believe you're like him. I think you were caught in his web, just as I was, just as others were before us. She stood to leave, placing cash on the table for their tea. What you do with this information is your choice. But I thought you deserved to know the truth before everything becomes public. As Eleanor walked away, Vega called after her, I'm sorry, for all of it. Eleanor paused, then turned back. So am I, for both of us. That night, in his suite at the Peninsula Hotel, Thaddeus sat alone in the dark, a glass of scotch untouched beside him. The room's luxury, Italian linens, marble bathroom, panoramic city view, felt hollow, a poor substitute for the life he'd built and lost in the span of 24 hours. His phone, usually buzzing with messages, had gone silent. Clients had abandoned him. Colleagues had disavowed him. Even Vega wasn't answering his calls. A knock at the door roused him from his dark thoughts. He opened it to find a hotel staff member holding an envelope. Delivery for you, Mr. Morissette. Thaddeus took the envelope and closed the door, turning it over in his hands. No return address, no postmark, hand-delivered. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small flash drive. The note read, simply, What you don't know will destroy what's left of your life. G.H. Thaddeus plugged the flash drive into his laptop. A video file opened automatically, showing a hospital corridor. The timestamp indicated it was from 5 months ago, around the time Vega had told him she was pregnant. In the video, Vega emerged from an examination room, her expression troubled. She was met in the hallway by Julian Ashford. They spoke intently, too far from the camera's microphone to be heard clearly. Then Julian placed his hand gently on Vega's still flat stomach, his expression a mixture of concern and something else. Ownership. The video ended, freezing on Julian's hand resting where Thaddeus's child supposedly grew. Thaddeus stared at the screen, the implications crashing over him in waves. Vega and Julian, the child he'd been so proud of, the heir Eleanor had failed to give him, wasn't his at all. Another knock at the door. This time, when Thaddeus opened it, he found himself face to face with Garrett Holloway. How does it feel? Garrett asked softly. To discover you've been betrayed by someone you trusted. To learn that everything you believed was a lie? Thaddeus lunged forward, his fist connecting with Garrett's jaw before he even realized what he was doing. Garrett stumbled back, but didn't fall, didn't fight back. "Feel better?" Garrett asked, straightening his jacket, a thin line of blood at the corner of his mouth. "It won't last. Nothing does for men like you, Thaddeus. Not success, not relationships, not even revenge." "Get out," Thaddeus growled, "before I call security." "By all means, create another scene," Garrett replied calmly. "I'm sure the press camped in the lobby would love to report on your assault of a visitor." Thaddeus stepped back, breathing heavily. "What do you want from me? You've taken everything already." "Not everything," Garrett said. "Not yet." With that cryptic statement, he turned and walked toward the elevators, leaving Thaddeus standing in the doorway. The image of Julian's hand on Vega's stomach burned into his mind. One more betrayal in a collapsing house of cards he'd built on betrayals of his own. 3 weeks after his world collapsed, Thaddeus Morissette stood in the middle of a one-bedroom apartment in Wicker Park, surrounded by moving boxes. The hardwood floors were scuffed, the kitchen appliances outdated, and the view from the windows showed only the brick wall of the adjacent building. At $2,200 a month, it was the best he could afford, while his assets remained frozen. He unpacked a box labeled clothes, pulling out shirts that had once been pressed by his personal valet, suits that had been tailored to his exact measurements in London. They seemed to belong to a different man now, relics from another life. His phone rang. It was Richard Keller, his attorney. "The SEC just expanded their investigation to include the Bergman acquisition," Richard reported without preamble. "They're suggesting you had advance knowledge of the regulatory approval and positioned client portfolios accordingly." "That was 5 years ago," Thaddeus protested, "and it was perfectly legal market analysis." "They've got communications between you and someone at the FTC dated 3 days before the public announcement." Thaddeus closed his eyes. Meredith Shapiro, an old friend from business school who'd joined the Federal Trade Commission, they'd had lunch. She'd mentioned offhandedly that good news was coming for one of his pending deals. He'd acted on it. "What else?" he asked wearily. "The court denied our motion to unfreeze the Aspen property assets. Judge says all properties remain under injunction until the divorce and criminal matters are resolved." Richard hesitated. "And there's a profile of Eleanor in tomorrow's Tribune. I got an advance copy. It's not good for you, Thaddeus." After ending the call, Thaddeus walked to the apartment's sole bathroom and splashed cold water on his face. The man in the mirror was almost unrecognizable, unshaven, hollow-eyed, diminished. 3 weeks of constant crisis had aged him years. His phone pinged with a news alert. "Breaking. Morissette Investments to be acquired by Goldman Sachs, renamed." So that was it. The company he'd built from nothing would now disappear, absorbed into a larger entity, his name erased as if he'd never existed. The board had moved quickly to salvage what they could from the wreckage of his reputation. Another text arrived, this one from an unknown number. "Channel 7 News at 6, don't miss it." Despite every instinct telling him not to look, Thaddeus turned on the apartment's ancient television and found the local news. The lead story featured Vega Morello, seated in a softly lit studio, her pregnancy now prominently visible at 6 months. "I was manipulated professionally and personally," she was saying, composed and articulate. "Mr. Morissette created an environment where compliance with his demands, both in business matters and in personal ones, felt like the only option." The interviewer leaned forward sympathetically. "And the child you're carrying?" Vega placed a protective hand on her stomach. "DNA testing has confirmed that Thaddeus Morissette is not the father. The actual father is a respected colleague who has been supportive throughout this ordeal." The camera cut to Julian Ashford standing off-screen, watching Vega with evident concern and affection. "Julian and I had a brief relationship before I became involved with Thaddeus," Vega continued. "When I discovered I was pregnant, Thaddeus assumed the child was his, and I was afraid to correct him." "Afraid?" the interviewer prompted. "I'd witnessed how he treated people who disappointed him, how he'd systematically sabotaged his wife's fertility treatments while blaming her for their childlessness. I was terrified of what he might do if he knew the truth." Thaddeus hurled his empty glass at the television. It missed, shattering against the wall behind it. "Liar!" he shouted at Vega's image. "You manipulative, ambitious liar!" But even as the words left his mouth, he recognized the hollow ring of hypocrisy. Hadn't he manipulated her? Hadn't he leveraged her ambition to secure both her professional compliance and her personal affections? For perhaps the first time, Thaddeus Morissette faced the possibility that he might be the architect of his own destruction. Eleanor Morissette stood in the center of her former art studio, now reopened after years of neglect. Sunlight streamed through the skylights, illuminating canvases, sculpture stands, and walls covered with exhibition catalogues and art books. The space smelled of paint, clay, and possibility. "It feels good to be back here," she told Dr. Winters, who sat observing her from a comfortable chair in the corner. For years, Thaddeus kept suggesting I convert it to a home theater or wine cellar. Eventually, I just closed the door and stopped coming in. "And now," prompted her therapist. "Now I'm reclaiming it, just like I'm reclaiming everything else." Eleanor touched a sculpture she'd been working on, an abstract piece representing fragmentation and reassembly. "I've accepted a consulting position with my old gallery, part-time to start, but it's a foothold back into the art world." Dr. Winters nodded approvingly. "You've made remarkable progress in a short time." "I had help," Eleanor acknowledged. "Miles, Caroline, Garrett, they gave me the tools to fight back, but the strength to use those tools, that had to come from within." "Tell me about Garrett," Dr. Winters said carefully. "Your team mentioned you've been spending considerable time together." Eleanor turned from her sculpture, her expression thoughtful. "Garrett understands something no one else in my life can, what it means to be systematically deceived by Thaddeus Morissette, to have your trust violated so completely that you question your own reality." His sister's experience. "Yes. Rebecca." Eleanor sat on a stool, absently cleaning clay from her hands. "He showed me her journals. The progression is hauntingly familiar. The initial adoration, the growing control, the subtle undermining, the isolation. And now that you've broken that cycle, now we're both finding our way forward," Eleanor said. "For 7 years, Garrett's life has been defined by his mission to expose Thaddeus. My life was defined by my marriage to him. We're both learning who we are without Thaddeus at the center of our existence." Dr. Winters made a note on her pad. "And the publicity? How are you handling that aspect?" Eleanor smiled ruefully. "The media loves a scandal, especially one involving wealth, power, and betrayal. I've had reporters camped outside my house, old acquaintances suddenly calling with concerns that somehow always lead to questions about Thaddeus. It's exhausting. Yet you agreed to the Tribune profile. On my terms. To reclaim my narrative." Eleanor stood and walked to the window overlooking the garden. "For years I was defined as Thaddeus Morissette's wife. Now I get to define myself." As if on cue, her phone chimed with a message from Caroline Wells. "Tribune pieces online. You come across as graceful, resilient, and formidable. Well done." Eleanor smiled at the message, but didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned back to her sculpture, adding a new element. A small, perfect sphere emerging from the fragmented pieces. Creation from destruction. Wholeness from brokenness. A new story beginning. In a small park near Lake Michigan, Garrett Holloway sat on a bench watching sailboats drift across the water. The early summer warmth had drawn families, joggers, and sunbathers to the shoreline, their laughter and conversations creating a tapestry of ordinary human joy. 7 years. For 7 years he had lived in a self-imposed purgatory of purpose, tracking Thaddeus Morissette, documenting his misdeeds, planning for the moment when justice could be served. 7 years during which he'd put his own life on hold, relationships, career advancement, everything secondary to his mission. "Mind if I join you?" Eleanor stood beside the bench, a takeout coffee in each hand. Garrett moved over, accepting the cup she offered. "I was just thinking about Rebecca," he said as Eleanor sat beside him. "Today would have been her 37th birthday." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, respecting his grief. "What was she like?" she finally asked. "Not as Thaddeus's victim, but as your sister." A genuine smile softened Garrett's usually guarded expression. "Brilliant, funny, stubborn as hell. She could debate you into the ground on any topic, but she'd do it with such charm that you'd thank her for the privilege of losing the argument. She sounds wonderful." She was. She got every academic honor, every professional opportunity through sheer talent and determination. Until Thaddeus. His expression darkened. He recognized her brilliance and saw it as something to possess, to control. When she got pregnant, he saw it as an inconvenience, a threat to his carefully constructed image and marriage. So he pressured her to terminate the pregnancy. Garrett nodded. And when she refused, he engineered her dismissal from the firm, created a paper trail of performance issues that had never existed, isolated her from colleagues who might have supported her. By the time she realized what was happening, her reputation was in tatters. They sat in silence for a while, watching the boats, sipping their coffee. The Tribune profile turned out well, Garrett finally said, changing the subject. You came across as exactly who you are. Strong, insightful, compassionate. I hope so, Eleanor replied. It's strange having strangers know intimate details of your life, having opinions about your marriage, your fertility struggles, your future. Ah, yes, the comment sections, Garrett said with a wry smile. Avoiding those would be wise. Too late, Eleanor admitted. I already saw someone suggest I engineered this whole thing to take control of Morissette Investments. As if I spent 3 years injecting myself with hormones and enduring miscarriages as part of an elaborate corporate takeover scheme. Garrett shook his head in disbelief. People will believe whatever narrative reinforces their worldview. Speaking of narratives, Eleanor said carefully, have you thought about what comes next for you after all this is resolved? The question caught Garrett off guard. For so long there had been no after in his thinking, only the pursuit of justice for Rebecca. Now with Thaddeus's downfall unfolding, he found himself standing at the edge of an unmapped future. I haven't allowed myself to think that far ahead, he admitted. My security consulting business has been running on autopilot while I focused on Thaddeus. I suppose I could expand that, take on more clients. Is that what you want? Garrett considered the question seriously. I don't know. For 7 years, my purpose has been clear. Now, he trailed off, uncharacteristically uncertain. Eleanor's hand briefly touched his, a gesture of understanding rather than romance. When you've defined yourself by a mission for so long, its completion can feel like a loss of identity. Exactly, he said, surprised by her insight. How did you know? Because I'm facing the same question, she replied simply. Who am I now that I'm not Mrs. Thaddeus Morissette? What do I want my life to be? Their eyes met in a moment of genuine connection. Two people who had been profoundly shaped by the same destructive force, now standing at the threshold of reconstruction. Whatever you decide, Garrett said softly, I have a feeling it will be remarkable. Vega Morello sat in Julian Ashford's spacious Lakeview apartment, reviewing the immunity agreement her attorney had negotiated with federal prosecutors. The terms were straightforward. In exchange for her testimony about financial improprieties at Morissette Investments, she would face no charges related to transactions she had executed under Thaddeus's direction. They want me to testify next week, she told Julian, who was preparing dinner in the kitchen, before the grand jury convenes to consider indictments. Julian looked up from the vegetables he was chopping. Are you ready for that? I don't think anyone's ever ready to testify against their former boss and lover in a federal fraud case, Vega replied with a half smile. But I don't have much choice. It's cooperate or potentially face charges myself. Julian set down his knife and came to sit beside her on the couch. You always have choices, Vega. I know good attorneys who could fight this. She shook her head. No, I need to take responsibility for my part in this. I knew some of those transactions weren't above board. I convinced myself they were standard industry practices, or that Thaddeus had approvals I wasn't privy to, but deep down I knew. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Their relationship, rekindled in the aftermath of the scandal, was still finding its footing. Both were careful, tentative, aware of the complex circumstances that had brought them back together. The baby kicked during the interview today, Vega said, changing the subject. Right when I mentioned your name. Julian's expression softened. Really? Here. She took his hand and placed it on her rounded belly. After a moment, they were rewarded with a definitive thump against his palm. Julian's face lit up with wonder. That's incredible. Vega watched him, this man who had stood by her through the most challenging period of her life, who had accepted responsibility for their child without hesitation, who had never once made her feel that her involvement with Thaddeus diminished her worth in his eyes. I don't deserve you, she said softly. Julian met her gaze. Everyone deserves someone who sees them clearly and loves them anyway, even with their mistakes, especially with their mistakes. Vega felt tears threatening. Hormones, she told herself, though she knew it was more than that. The media circus will die down eventually, Julian assured her, correctly reading her concerns. We'll figure out our relationship on our own terms, away from the spotlight. And if Thaddeus goes to trial, if I have to testify in open court, then we'll face that too, together. Julian's conviction was unwavering. What matters is that we're building something honest, something real, something real. After months of living in an elaborate construct of lies, Thaddeus's lies, her own lies, the simple truth of Julian's words felt like solid ground beneath her feet. In a downtown law office, Thaddeus Morissette sat across from his new attorney, Bennett Walsh, a specialist in white-collar criminal defense whom Richard had reluctantly recommended after admitting the case had grown beyond his expertise. The feds have a strong paper trail, Bennett was saying, reviewing the case files, but not insurmountable. Their star witness is Vega Morello, who's compromised by her own involvement in the transactions. We can work with that. Thaddeus nodded mechanically. He'd spent the morning watching his former clients announce their new relationships with Goldman Sachs on CNBC. The company he'd built was being systematically dismantled and reabsorbed, his name already erased from the website, the signage, the promotional materials. "Are you listening, Thaddeus?" Bennett asked, noting his client's distraction. "Yes. Attack Vega's credibility. Paint her as complicit, ambitious, vindictive after being rejected. That's part of it," Bennett agreed, "but we also need to address the offshore accounts. The prosecutor will portray them as evidence of intent to conceal wrongdoing." "They were tax optimization structures," Thaddeus replied automatically. "Standard practice for high net worth clients. Without proper disclosures, without client consent." Thaddeus waved his hand dismissively. "Details handled by back office staff. I wasn't involved in day-to-day compliance matters." Bennett leaned forward, his expression serious. "That defense contradicts the documentary evidence, Thaddeus. There are emails where you explicitly direct employees to bypass compliance protocols. Those emails could be interpreted multiple ways. Not by a jury of average citizens who already believe all Wall Street executives are corrupt." Bennett closed the file in front of him. "We need to consider a plea arrangement." Thaddeus stiffened. "Absolutely not. I'm not accepting guilt for running my business as I saw fit, even if it means avoiding a lengthy prison sentence." Even then, Thaddeus stood abruptly, pacing the office. "Do you know what I built, Bennett? Do you have any idea what it takes to create something from nothing? To see opportunities others miss? To take calculated risks while others cower in mediocrity?" Bennett watched him calmly. "I understand you're a builder, Thaddeus, an entrepreneur, a visionary. But right now, you need to be a pragmatist. The government has you in their sights. Your wife has provided them with both evidence and motive. Your former protégé is testifying against you. Your board has abandoned you. So you're saying it's hopeless? That I should just give up everything I've worked for? Admit to crimes I don't believe I committed?" "I'm saying we need to be strategic," Bennett clarified. "And speaking of strategy, there's a new development you should be aware of." He slid a document across the desk. Thaddeus picked it up, scanning the contents. "The SEC is offering a reduced settlement?" he asked, confused. "Why now?" "Apparently some questions have been raised about the chain of custody for certain evidence, and about the motivations of some witnesses." Thaddeus read further, his pulse quickening. "They're offering no admission of guilt, a financial penalty, and a 5-year ban from serving as an officer of a public company." He looked up sharply. "This would effectively end the criminal investigation." Bennett nodded. "It's an unusual turn of events. My contact at the SEC wasn't forthcoming about why the offer's being made now, but it represents a potential way out of your current situation. A costly one, but far better than the alternative." For the first time in weeks, Thaddeus felt a flicker of hope. This was what he excelled at, finding daylight in the darkest situations, leveraging weaknesses in opponents' positions, turning setbacks into opportunities. "What about the divorce?" he asked. "Does this affect Eleanor's case against me?" "Not directly, but it would significantly reduce the public relations leverage she currently holds. Without a criminal conviction, you're just another wealthy couple going through an acrimonious divorce." Thaddeus studied the settlement offer again. The financial penalty was substantial, $18 million, but not ruinous. The professional limitations were irritating but manageable through creative corporate structures. Most importantly, it would allow him to maintain his freedom and begin rebuilding. "I want to accept this," he said decisively. Bennett raised an eyebrow. "Don't you want to consider it overnight? Talk to your financial advisors. No. This is the breakthrough I've been waiting for. I want to move on it immediately before they reconsider. As Bennett began preparing the necessary paperwork, Thaddeus felt a surge of the old confidence returning. This was the first step toward reclaiming what was rightfully his. The SEC settlement would neutralize the most serious threats. The divorce would be messy but manageable. He could rebuild his firm under a different name, with new partners. This wasn't the end of Thaddeus Morissette. It was merely an intermission before his triumphant return. That evening, Eleanor sat in her study reviewing documentation for the next day's meeting with forensic accountants. The full scope of Thaddeus's financial machinations was still emerging. Layers of corporate entities, undisclosed accounts, elaborate mechanisms for disguising the movement of money. Her phone rang. It was Caroline Wells, her divorce attorney. "I just heard from Richard Keller," Caroline said without preamble. "The SEC has offered Thaddeus a settlement. No admission of wrongdoing, a financial penalty, and a temporary ban from serving as a public company officer." Eleanor frowned. Why would the SEC suddenly back down? They have him dead to rights on multiple violations. That's the strange part. Richard seemed surprised himself. He mentioned something about evidentiary issues but was vague on specifics. A cold certainty settled in Eleanor's stomach. Thaddeus found a way in. A connection? A pressure point? A bribe? Something to undermine the case from within. "It's possible," Caroline acknowledged. "The SEC is generally above board, but not immune to influence. However, this doesn't change our divorce strategy. We still have overwhelming evidence of his personal misconduct and financial deception." After ending the call, Eleanor sat motionless, processing this development. Of course, Thaddeus would find a way to slip the noose. He always did. His talent for self-preservation was unmatched, his network of connections and favors extensive. Her phone rang again. "Garrett." "You heard?" she asked by way of greeting. "I heard," he confirmed, his voice tight. "It's not a coincidence. Thaddeus has a history with the SEC's Chicago office director. They served on a financial industry advisory board together 5 years ago. So he called in a favor. More likely promised information on bigger targets in exchange for leniency. Classic Thaddeus, sacrificing others to save himself." Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling a familiar weariness. Just when she thought justice might prevail, Thaddeus found another escape route. "What does this mean for our strategy?" she asked. There was a brief silence on the line. Then Garrett spoke with quiet determination. "It means we move to Plan B, the evidence we've been holding back, the final revelation." Eleanor hesitated. They had discussed this contingency, the nuclear option that would destroy what remained of Thaddeus's reputation and possibility of redemption. Once deployed, there would be no turning back. "Are you sure? Once we do this?" "I'm sure," Garrett replied, his resolve evident. "Thaddeus thinks he's won. He thinks he's outmaneuvered us. Let him enjoy that feeling. For now." As she ended the call, Eleanor turned to the window, watching night settle over Chicago. In the distance, lights began to appear in office towers and apartment buildings, thousands of separate lives unfolding, each with their own struggles and triumphs. Somewhere out there, Thaddeus would be celebrating his apparent victory, already planning his resurrection. The thought didn't anger her anymore. Instead, she felt a strange calm, a certainty that transcended the chaos of recent weeks. This wasn't the end of their story. It was merely the calm before the final storm. The Cook County Courthouse stood as a monument to justice, ornate, imposing, and today surrounded by news vans and reporters jostling for position. The Morissette divorce had transcended financial news to become a national sensation, a cautionary tale of wealth, power, and betrayal playing out in real time. Thaddeus adjusted his custom-made suit as he climbed the courthouse steps, projecting confidence despite the shouted questions from reporters. "Mr. Morissette, will you address the allegations of manipulation? What's your response to the SEC settlement critics calling it a sweetheart deal? Is it true your mistress's baby isn't yours?" He ignored them all, following Bennett Walsh through the gauntlet. Inside, his new PR consultant waited, a sleek woman with sharp eyes who had specialized in rehabilitating the images of fallen CEOs. "Remember the narrative," she reminded him in a low voice. "You're a successful businessman who made some regulatory missteps while distracted by personal issues. You've accepted responsibility through the SEC settlement. You're moving forward." Thaddeus nodded mechanically. The past 2 weeks had seen a remarkable reversal in his fortunes. The SEC settlement had indeed neutralized the most serious legal threats. His bank had unfrozen one of his personal accounts after intense pressure from his attorneys. Former colleagues who had abandoned him were cautiously reconnecting, testing the waters. Eleanor's team filed a motion to introduce new evidence yesterday, Bennett informed him. Judge Palmer denied it as coming too late in the proceedings. What evidence? Thaddeus asked sharply. They wouldn't specify, but Caroline Wells seemed unusually confident despite the denial. Bennett shrugged. Probably a bluff. They're running out of ammunition. They entered the courtroom where the divorce proceedings had been ongoing for weeks. Thaddeus's gaze immediately found Eleanor, seated at the opposite table. She wore a simple navy dress that emphasized her natural elegance, her posture straight, her expression composed. Beside her sat Caroline Wells, her formidable divorce attorney, and to his surprise, Garrett Holloway. The sight of Holloway sent a surge of hatred through Thaddeus. The man had systematically dismantled his life, exposed his secrets, turned his wife against him. Yet there he sat, calm and unaffected, as if he were merely an observer rather than the architect of destruction. "All rise," called the bailiff as Judge Palmer entered the courtroom. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s with a reputation for fairness and efficiency, took her seat and surveyed the proceedings with practiced neutrality. "I understand we have reached the financial testimony portion of these proceedings," she stated. "Ms. Wells, you may call your first witness." Caroline Wells stood. "Your Honor, the petitioner calls Dr. Samantha Reynolds, forensic accountant." A sharp-featured woman with silver-streaked hair took the stand, carrying a thick binder of documentation. After establishing her credentials, 20 years with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit before entering private practice, she turned to the evidence. "Mrs. Morissette's team engaged my firm to conduct a comprehensive analysis of the marital assets," Dr. Reynolds explained. "What we discovered was one of the most elaborate systems of financial concealment I've encountered in my career." Screens around the courtroom displayed a complex diagram of interconnected entities, offshore accounts, and shell companies. Mr. Morissette created a parallel financial structure that allowed him to divert marital assets into accounts that only he controlled, Dr. Reynolds continued. Conservative estimates indicate approximately $86 million was hidden from Mrs. Morissette and from tax authorities. Thaddeus leaned toward Bennett. "That's absurd. Those structures were for legitimate tax optimization." Bennett frowned, studying the diagram. "Some of these entities, I don't recognize them from the disclosures you provided. Over $42 million was transferred to accounts in Grand Cayman, Singapore, and Liechtenstein during the past 5 years alone," Dr. Reynolds continued. "These transfers coincided with major liquidity events at Morissette Investments, client exits, capital raises, bonus distributions." As she spoke, bank statements appeared on the screens, highlighting the transactions in question. Thaddeus felt a chill run through him. Those particular accounts weren't supposed to be traceable back to him. He'd used cutouts, proxies, multiple layers of corporate entities. "How did they find these?" he whispered to Bennett. Bennett didn't answer, his expression growing increasingly concerned as Dr. Reynolds continued her methodical presentation. "Most troubling," the forensic accountant concluded, "is that many of these hidden assets appear to have been accumulated during periods when Mr. Morissette claimed financial hardship to reduce Mrs. Morissette's involvement in major expenditure decisions. For instance, in 2019, when Mrs. Morissette wished to donate $2 million to the Chicago Children's Medical Foundation, Mr. Morissette claimed liquidity constraints, while simultaneously transferring $8.4 million to a Singapore account. Eleanor's face remained impassive, but Thaddeus could read the confirmation in her eyes. She'd suspected this all along, but lacked proof until now. When Dr. Reynolds finished, Bennett rose for cross-examination, attempting to characterize the accounts as standard wealth management practices, but his questions lacked conviction, undermined by the comprehensive documentation already presented. As Bennett sat down, whispering that they needed to confer during the lunch break, Judge Palmer checked her watch. "We'll take a 15-minute recess before the next witness." In a small conference room, Thaddeus paced while Bennett reviewed the forensic accountant's report. "This is bad, Thaddeus. Very bad. Some of these accounts weren't disclosed in our financial filings with the court. That's potential perjury." Those accounts aren't technically in my name, Thaddeus countered, but they're clearly under your control. The paper trail Dr. Reynolds presented establishes that beyond reasonable doubt. Bennett set down the report. We need to adjust our strategy immediately. I recommend offering a significantly improved settlement package before this gets worse. Worse? How could it get worse? Bennett looked at him incredulously. The judge could refer this evidence to prosecutors. The SEC could revisit their settlement, claiming material omissions, and Eleanor could end up with not just half of your disclosed assets, but all of these hidden ones as well. Thaddeus sank into a chair, the gravity of his situation finally penetrating his wall of denial. Make the offer, he conceded. 50-50 split of everything, clean break. Bennett nodded, relieved. It's the right move. I'll approach Caroline during the recess. But when court resumed, Caroline Wells showed no interest in Bennett's whispered settlement overture. Instead, she called her next witness, Vega Morello. 6 months pregnant now, Vega walked to the stand with deliberate dignity, ignoring Thaddeus completely. After being sworn in, she waited calmly for questioning to begin. Ms. Morello, Caroline started, could you describe your professional relationship with Thaddeus Morissette? I joined Morissette Investments as an analyst 4 years ago, Vega replied. I was promoted to senior investment strategist after 2 years, reporting directly to Thaddeus. And your personal relationship? It began approximately 14 months ago. Thaddeus initiated it during a business trip to New York. Did Mr. Morissette ever discuss his marriage with you? Vega nodded. Frequently. He portrayed Eleanor as emotionally unstable, obsessed with having a child to the detriment of their relationship. He claimed she was refusing to accept medical reality, that she couldn't conceive, and that it was destroying their marriage. Did he ever mention tampering with Mrs. Morissette's fertility medications? Objection, Bennett called. Hearsay. Your Honor, this goes directly to Mr. Morissette's state of mind and his actions affecting the marital relationship, Caroline countered. I'll allow it, Judge Palmer ruled. The witness may answer. Vega took a deep breath. He never explicitly stated he was tampering with her medications, but approximately 8 months ago, I entered his office unexpectedly and found him transferring pills between prescription bottles. When I asked what he was doing, he said he was helping Eleanor move on from an impossible dream. I didn't understand what he meant at the time. Thaddeus gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. Vega had never mentioned witnessing this. She'd been withholding this revelation, waiting for the perfect moment to deploy it. Ms. Morello, when you became pregnant, what was Mr. Morissette's reaction? Caroline continued. Initially shock, then pride. He said it proved the problem in his marriage wasn't him, that he was perfectly capable of producing a child with the right woman. Vega's voice remained steady, but her eyes flashed with controlled anger. He began making plans for our future together, suggesting that once his divorce was finalized, we would marry and raise the child together. And did you believe him? At first, until I discovered something disturbing in his home office while retrieving some work documents. Vega paused. It was a file about Rebecca Holloway, a former employee who had committed suicide 7 years earlier. The file contained surveillance photos, medical records, and a handwritten note from Thaddeus outlining a strategy for handling her pregnancy. In the gallery, a murmur rose. Judge Palmer gavelled for silence. What was in this strategy? Caroline asked. A step-by-step plan to pressure her to terminate the pregnancy, to isolate her professionally, to create documentation undermining her work performance. The final note simply said, "Problem resolved, file closed." Thaddeus leapt to his feet. That's a lie. I never wrote any such document. Mr. Morissette, Judge Palmer's voice cracked like a whip. Control yourself, or I'll have you removed from my courtroom. Mr. Walsh, control your client. Bennett tugged Thaddeus back into his seat, whispering urgently, "Don't give them ammunition, let me handle this." But Thaddeus barely heard him. His mind was racing. There was no such document. He'd never been so careless as to write down his plans for handling Rebecca, which meant Vega was lying, or Holloway had fabricated evidence. As Vega's testimony continued, detailing manipulative behavior and questionable financial directives from Thaddeus, he found it increasingly difficult to maintain his composure. Each revelation seemed calibrated to strip away another layer of his carefully constructed facade. After Vega stepped down, Caroline called her final witness, Eleanor herself. Eleanor took the stand with quiet dignity, her gaze briefly meeting Thaddeus's before focusing on her attorney. "Mrs. Morissette," Caroline began, "you've heard the testimony regarding your husband's financial deceptions and personal misconduct. How has learning these truths affected you?" Eleanor considered the question. "When I first discovered Thaddeus's betrayals, I felt utterly destroyed, not just by his infidelity or financial deceptions, but by the realization that the life I thought we were building together was a carefully constructed illusion." Her voice gained strength as she continued. "For years I blamed myself for our inability to have children. I subjected my body to painful treatments, injections, procedures, all while Thaddeus systematically ensured they would fail. He watched me suffer, comforted me through my grief, all while knowing he was the cause of it." "Why do you think he did this?" Caroline asked. "Objection," Bennett called. "Calls for speculation." "Sustained," Judge Palmer ruled. "Rephrase, counselor." Caroline nodded. "Did Thaddeus ever express reservations about having children with you?" "Never openly. But looking back, there were signs. He would delay appointments, create conflicts that prevented him from attending critical procedures. When I became pregnant naturally, his reaction seemed performative, like he was playing the role of excited husband, rather than genuinely sharing my joy." "And when you lost that pregnancy?" Eleanor's composure wavered slightly. "He was away on business when it happened. In New York, supposedly. I later learned he was with Vega. When he returned, he said all the right things, but there was a detachment in his eyes. Now I understand why." "Your Honor," Caroline said, "I'd like to introduce one final piece of evidence." Bennett immediately objected. "Your Honor, the court already ruled against the introduction of new evidence at this late stage." "This isn't new evidence, Your Honor," Caroline countered. "It's directly relevant to Mrs. Morissette's testimony regarding her miscarriage and Mr. Morissette's responsibility." Judge Palmer considered briefly. "I'll allow it, but it better be directly relevant as you claim." Caroline nodded to her assistant, who distributed documents to the judge, the court reporter, and Bennett. Thaddeus leaned over to see what they contained. It was a laboratory analysis of Eleanor's blood samples from the day of her miscarriage, with certain compounds highlighted. Attached was a toxicology report explaining the findings. "Mrs. Morissette," Caroline continued, "can you tell the court what this document shows?" Eleanor's voice was steady, despite the emotional weight of her words. "These are the results of an additional toxicology panel run on my blood samples from the day I miscarried. They show elevated levels of mifepristone, a medication used to terminate pregnancies." A shocked silence fell over the courtroom. "And how would this substance have entered your system?" Caroline asked quietly. "The night before I miscarried, Thaddeus insisted on preparing a special dinner for me. He said it was to celebrate reaching the second trimester. He made my favorite tea, served it to me himself." Eleanor's eyes found Thaddeus's across the courtroom. "I now believe he deliberately introduced this medication into my tea, causing the termination of my pregnancy." The courtroom erupted. Judge Palmer banged her gavel repeatedly for order, while Thaddeus sat frozen, the blood draining from his face. "That's impossible," he whispered to Bennett. "There's no way they could prove—" But Bennett wasn't listening. He was reading the toxicology report with growing horror. "Mr. Walsh," Judge Palmer called when order was restored, "your cross-examination." Bennett stood slowly, visibly shaken. "For Your Honor, I request a brief recess to confer with my client regarding this new information." "Granted, 20 minutes." In the conference room, Bennett closed the door and faced Thaddeus. "Did you do it?" he demanded without preamble. "Did you deliberately terminate Eleanor's pregnancy?" "Of course not," Thaddeus protested. "This is another fabrication, like that supposed file on Rebecca Holloway. They're desperate. This isn't something they could fabricate, Thaddeus. These are hospital blood samples that have been in storage. Chain of custody is documented. The testing methodology is sound." Bennett ran a hand through his hair. "If this is true, we're no longer talking about financial improprieties or marital betrayal. We're talking about assault, potentially worse." "It's not true," Thaddeus insisted, though a cold sweat had broken out across his back. "Eleanor was stressed, working too hard on that charity event. The doctor said the miscarriage was likely due to stress. And you never put anything in her tea, nothing at all," Bennett pressed. Thaddeus hesitated a fraction too long. "I gave her a herbal supplement for relaxation. A client recommended it." Bennett stared at him. "A herbal supplement? What was in it?" "I don't know exactly. It was from an alternative medicine practitioner in China, but it was supposed to be calming, not harmful. Bennett closed his eyes briefly. Thaddeus, if that supplement contained mifepristone, and you administered it without her knowledge— I didn't know what it contained, Thaddeus protested, his voice rising. I was trying to help her relax, that's all. But even as the words left his mouth, Thaddeus recognized their hollowness. The supplement had come from Dr. Liu, a client who specialized in fertility issues. Thaddeus had explained Eleanor's pregnancy, expressed concerns about her mental state, her readiness for motherhood. Dr. Liu had provided the packets with careful instructions, 1 per day, dissolved in hot liquid. The pregnancy is causing her distress, Dr. Liu had said. These will help restore balance. Thaddeus had never asked what they contained. He hadn't wanted to know. When they returned to the courtroom, Thaddeus felt as if he were moving through a nightmare. Bennett's cross-examination of Eleanor was perfunctory, almost apologetic. The attorney clearly no longer believed in his client's innocence. As Eleanor stepped down from the witness stand, her eyes met Thaddeus's. In that moment, he saw not hatred or triumph, but something worse— clarity. She saw him completely, all pretense stripped away, all manipulations exposed. Judge Palmer checked her watch. We'll adjourn for today and resume tomorrow morning with closing arguments. Given the nature of today's testimony, I'm ordering an expedited review by the court's appointed medical expert of the toxicology evidence presented. As the courtroom began to empty, Thaddeus remained seated, unable to move. The magnitude of what he had done, not just to Eleanor but to Rebecca, to Vega, to countless others he had used and discarded, crashed over him like a physical weight. Bennett gathered his papers. We need to discuss options, Thaddeus. Your exposure here goes beyond the divorce now. But Thaddeus barely heard him. Across the emptying courtroom, Garrett Holloway stood waiting, watching him with an expression of grim satisfaction. You did this, Thaddeus said when Garrett approached. You orchestrated all of it. No, Thaddeus, Garrett replied quietly. You did this. I merely documented it. Every decision, every betrayal, every calculated cruelty. He placed a small flash drive on the table. And I'm not finished yet. What's this? Thaddeus asked, not touching it. The complete record, every piece of evidence we've gathered over 7 years, including communications with Dr. Liu about the herbal supplement you gave Eleanor. Garrett's eyes were cold. The police are waiting outside to speak with you about the toxicology findings. This gives you approximately 5 minutes to decide what kind of man you really are. With that, Garrett walked away, leaving Thaddeus alone with the flash drive and the weight of his own actions. Outside the courtroom, Eleanor stood with Caroline, discussing next steps. When Garrett joined them, Eleanor studied his expression. You spoke to him, she said. It wasn't a question. Garrett nodded. I gave him the drive. Do you think he'll— A commotion from inside the courtroom interrupted her. Raised voices, then the sound of someone running. Moments later, the doors burst open, and Thaddeus emerged, pale and desperate, flanked by 2 police officers. Their eyes met one final time as he was led away. Thaddeus Morissette, once master of his universe, now reduced to a common suspect, being escorted to an uncertain fate. Behind him, forgotten on the conference room table, lay the flash drive containing the final pieces of evidence against him, and perhaps his last chance at understanding the truth about himself. The Metropolitan Detention Center bore little resemblance to the luxury accommodations Thaddeus Morissette had grown accustomed to. The concrete walls, fluorescent lighting, and constant noise created an environment designed to strip away pretense and privilege. For the first time in decades, Thaddeus found himself in a place where his name, his wealth, and his connections meant nothing. 3 days had passed since his arrest on charges related to Eleanor's miscarriage. The initial hearing had set bail at $5 million, a sum that would have been insignificant weeks ago, but now presented a formidable obstacle with his assets frozen and his reputation in tatters. Bennett Walsh sat across from him in the visitation room, looking haggard. The past 72 hours had aged the attorney considerably. The toxicology report has been verified by 2 independent labs, Bennett said without preamble. The substances in Eleanor's system match components found in the supplements Dr. Liu provided. His office has been raided, and he's cooperating fully with investigators. Thaddeus stared at his hands, the reality of his situation settling over him like a shroud. What's he saying? That you specifically requested something to resolve a difficult pregnancy situation. Fifth, that you expressed concerns about Eleanor's mental stability and the potential impact of parenthood on your lifestyle and career. Bennett's voice was clinical, detached. He claims he made it clear the supplements would cause uterine contractions and potential termination, though he used euphemistic language. He's lying, Thaddeus said automatically, though the denial sounded hollow even to his own ears. He never explained what they would do. Bennett set down his pen and looked directly at his client. Thaddeus, we're past the point where these denials serve any purpose. The evidence is overwhelming. Your communications with Dr. Liu, the timing of the supplement administration, the presence of mifepristone in Eleanor's system, the documented pattern of tampering with her fertility medications. So what are you saying? Thaddeus demanded. That I should plead guilty, admit to intentionally causing Eleanor's miscarriage. I'm saying we need to consider a comprehensive plea arrangement that addresses both the current charges and potential additional ones. The prosecutor has indicated willingness to discuss terms, but only if we move quickly. Thaddeus laughed bitterly. Of course, everyone wants their pound of flesh as efficiently as possible. It's not just about efficiency, Bennett countered. The prosecutor is concerned about Eleanor. A trial would force her to relive the trauma publicly, to have her medical history scrutinized by defense experts. She's been through enough. The statement hung in the air between them. She's been through enough. A simple truth that Thaddeus had never considered during their marriage. What Eleanor had been through. What she had endured. What he had put her through. There's something else, Bennett continued after a moment. The flash drive Garrett Holloway left for you. My investigator was able to access a copy. He hesitated. It contains evidence related to Rebecca Holloway's death that could potentially lead to additional charges. Manslaughter, potentially. Thaddeus felt the blood drain from his face. That's absurd. I had nothing to do with her suicide. The evidence suggests otherwise. There are emails showing you directed the HR department to create a false performance improvement file for her after learning of her pregnancy. Communications with building security, restricting her access to certain floors. Directions to IT to monitor her communications. Bennett met Thaddeus's gaze directly, and most damaging, a recording of a conversation where you explicitly threatened to ensure she would never work in finance again if she went public with the pregnancy. Thaddeus closed his eyes, memories flooding back. That conversation in the empty conference room after hours. Rebecca crying, pleading for understanding. His cold calculation that a child would complicate his life, threaten his carefully crafted image, potentially damage his marriage if Eleanor discovered the affair. I never told her to kill herself, he whispered. No, Bennett agreed. But you systematically destroyed everything she valued, her career, her reputation, her future prospects, while she was in an emotionally vulnerable state. A prosecutor could make a compelling case for reckless indifference leading to death. The weight of his actions settled over Thaddeus with crushing force. He had spent years compartmentalizing his behavior, justifying each decision as necessary, pragmatic, or deserved. Now, with his defenses stripped away, he was forced to confront the truth of what he had done, not just to Eleanor or Rebecca, but to everyone who had trusted him. What are the terms? He asked finally, his voice barely audible. Bennett opened his briefcase and removed a document. The prosecutor is offering a single count of felony assault with a toxic substance in Eleanor's case, with a recommended sentence of 7 to 10 years. No charges related to Rebecca Holloway's death, but a substantial restitution payment to a foundation being established in her name. And the divorce? Total surrender of all assets discovered during litigation. Eleanor receives the penthouse, the vacation properties, her family heirlooms, and 75% of all investment accounts. You retain only your personal account at Chase and a modest stipend from a trust to be established with a portion of the remaining assets. She gets everything, Thaddeus said flatly. Not everything, just what she's legally entitled to, plus compensation for the extraordinary circumstances. Bennett's tone hardened slightly. It's considerably more generous than what a jury would likely award after hearing the full evidence. Thaddeus leaned back in his chair, the harsh fluorescent light casting shadows across his face. And if I fight? Then we go to trial on all charges. The divorce proceeds with full public disclosure of all evidence. The prosecutor adds charges related to Rebecca Holloway. The SEC re-examines their settlement in light of new evidence of character and conduct. Bennett packed away his papers. "And you spend the next several years in a cell much like this one, fighting battles you can't win." The attorney stood to leave, then hesitated. "There's one more thing you should know. About Vega's baby." "It's not mine," Thaddeus said dully. "I know. Julian Ashford is the father." Bennett looked surprised. "You knew?" "Holloway showed me surveillance video. Julian and Vega together at her doctor's appointment. The paternity test merely confirmed what I already suspected. And yet you continued the relationship, planned a future together. Why?" Thaddeus considered the question, confronting truths about himself he had long avoided. "Because she represented something Eleanor couldn't give me. Because the pregnancy, even if the child wasn't mine, proved I had taken something valuable from another man. Because it was easier than admitting I had failed at the one relationship that should have mattered." Bennett studied his client with a mixture of pity and professional detachment. "I'll need your decision on the plea arrangement by tomorrow morning. The prosecutor won't wait longer than that." After Bennett departed, Thaddeus remained in the visitation room, staring at the blank wall opposite him. For the first time in his adult life, he had no strategy, no angle to play, no leverage to exploit. The carefully constructed edifice of power and control he had built over decades had crumbled, revealing the hollow core at its center. Eleanor Morissette stood in the gallery space of the Chicago Museum of Contemporary Art, surrounded by photographs, journal entries, and artistic interpretations of psychological manipulation and recovery. The exhibition, titled Invisible Chains, featured stories of survivors of coercive control and emotional abuse, including her own. 6 months had passed since Thaddeus had accepted the plea agreement. 6 months of rebuilding, of reclaiming her narrative, of transforming private pain into public purpose. The Rebecca Holloway Foundation, established with the restitution funds from Thaddeus's plea deal and supplemented by Eleanor's personal contribution, had already provided support to dozens of women escaping manipulative relationships. "The installation in the East Wing is particularly powerful," said Marcus Chen, the museum's director, as he approached. "Your curation brings a cohesion to these diverse experiences." Eleanor smiled, pleased by the professional recognition. Her return to the art world had begun tentatively, a consulting role here, a guest curation there, but had quickly blossomed into a full renaissance of her career. "Thank you, Marcus. These artists deserved a platform that honored both their pain and their resilience." As they discussed final preparations for the exhibition's opening gala the following evening, Eleanor caught sight of Garrett Holloway entering the gallery. In the months since the trial, their relationship had evolved from allies united by a common enemy to friends bound by mutual respect and understanding. "I didn't expect you until tomorrow," she said when Marcus departed. "I finished in New York early," Garrett replied. "Thought I'd stop by before the crowds descend." They walked together through the exhibition, pausing occasionally to discuss particular pieces. Garrett had changed in subtle ways since Thaddeus's sentencing. The drive that had sustained him for 7 years now channeled into the Foundation's work and his expanding security consulting business. "The Boston group wants to establish a local chapter," he informed her as they examined a powerful black and white photograph showing hands breaking free from invisible restraints. "They've already identified 3 local therapists specializing in recovery from coercive control." "That's wonderful," Eleanor replied. "We should connect them with Dr. Winters for training resources." They reached the final installation, a room where visitors could record their own experiences or messages of support for survivors. The walls were already filling with handwritten notes, creating a powerful testament to shared human experience. "Have you heard anything?" Garrett asked quietly, the question hanging between them with no need for elaboration. Eleanor nodded. "His attorney contacted mine yesterday. He's been transferred to the minimum security facility in Oxford. Apparently, he's been a model prisoner." "Does that surprise you?" "Not at all," she replied. "Thaddeus has always excelled at adapting to whatever environment would best serve his interests. Even in prison, he'd find a way to establish himself in the hierarchy, to secure whatever privileges are available." They found a bench in a quiet corner of the gallery, sitting in companionable silence for a moment. "I received a letter from him," Eleanor admitted finally, "his first direct communication since the sentencing." Garrett's expression showed concern, but not surprise. What did he want? To apologize, to explain, to be forgiven. She shook her head slightly. 7 pages of what appeared to be heartfelt remorse and self-reflection. But you don't believe it's genuine? Eleanor considered the question carefully. I believe he's sorry he was caught. Sorry he lost everything. Perhaps even sorry for the pain he caused. But true remorse requires empathy, the ability to truly understand another's suffering. I'm not convinced Thaddeus is capable of that. Garrett nodded, understanding. Did you respond? No. Eleanor looked around at the exhibition she had curated, at the stories of survival and resilience surrounding them. I've said everything I needed to say to Thaddeus. My focus now is on the future, not the past. As they prepared to leave, Garrett hesitated, then spoke with uncharacteristic uncertainty. I've been wondering, when this is all further behind us, if you might consider dinner, not as colleagues or fellow board members, just as people. Eleanor studied him thoughtfully. Over the months of working together, their relationship had developed a depth neither had anticipated. There was an understanding between them, born of shared experience, a respect that had grown into something more complex. I think, she said carefully, that when we're both ready, that would be nice. It wasn't a passionate declaration or a dramatic new beginning. It was something more valuable, an honest acknowledgement of possibility between two people who had journeyed through darkness and emerged intact. Vega Morello adjusted her sleeping son in her arms, marveling at his tiny perfections. At 8 weeks old, Thomas Julian Ashford had his father's thoughtful brow and his mother's determined chin, a perfect blend of two people who had found their way to each other through an unlikely path. Is he finally asleep? Julian asked, entering their apartment's nursery with 2 mugs of tea. Just now, Vega whispered, gently placing Thomas in his crib. He fought it every step of the way. Stubborn like his mother, Julian observed with affection, handing her a mug. They moved to the living room where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of Lake Michigan. The apartment, modest by the standards of their former lifestyle but comfortable and welcoming, had become a true home in the months since Thomas's birth. The SEC called again, Julian said, settling beside her on the sofa. They want me to consult on new compliance protocols being developed after the Morissette case. Vega nodded thoughtfully. Will you do it? I think so. It feels like a way to create something positive from the experience. He studied her expression. What about you? Have you thought more about the business school offer? After leaving Morissette Investments, Vega had taken time to reevaluate her career path. Her testimony against Thaddeus had effectively closed certain doors in the financial industry, but had opened others she hadn't anticipated. Northwestern's business school had approached her about developing a course on ethical decision-making in finance. I'm going to accept, she decided. Teaching wasn't something I ever considered, but the chance to help shape how future financial professionals understand ethics and responsibility, it feels right. Julian smiled, genuinely pleased. You'll be wonderful at it. Their conversation was interrupted by a news alert on Vega's phone. She checked it, then handed it silently to Julian. The headline read, Former Finance CEO Thaddeus Morissette begins counseling program at federal prison. Do you ever think about him? Julian asked quietly after reading the article. Vega considered the question honestly. Less and less. Sometimes I remember moments, things he said, decisions he pushed me to make, and I feel angry all over again. Not just at him, but at myself for being so willing to compromise my own values. You can't blame yourself. He was a master manipulator. I know, but I was a willing participant, at least initially. She rested her hand on Julian's. What I regret most is the harm my choices caused to Eleanor. No career advancement was worth contributing to another woman's pain. Julian squeezed her hand gently. You've made amends in the best way possible, by telling the truth, by cooperating with the investigation, by changing your path forward. Vega nodded, grateful for his understanding. The past year had taught her difficult lessons about integrity, about the true cost of ambition divorced from ethics, about the insidious nature of manipulation. She had emerged humbled but wiser, determined to build a life and career that she could be proud of. I saw Eleanor last week, she said after a moment, at a foundation event downtown. How was that? Awkward, initially, but then surprisingly okay. She's done remarkable work with the foundation, helping women recognize and escape situations like hers. Vega paused, remembering the brief but significant interaction. She asked about the baby, seemed genuinely happy when I showed her a picture. Eleanor is an extraordinary person, Julian observed, to transform what happened to her into something that helps others. Not everyone could do that. Vega agreed silently, thinking about the different paths their lives had taken since the implosion of Thaddeus's empire. Eleanor had reclaimed her identity and created meaningful purpose from her trauma. Vega and Julian had found unexpected happiness together, building a family based on honesty rather than manipulation. And Thaddeus had lost everything: his company, his wealth, his freedom, his reputation. But most significantly, he had lost the elaborate fiction he had constructed about himself, the myth of the brilliant, untouchable man who could control everyone and everything around him. As Vega looked at her sleeping son through the nursery monitor, she felt a deep gratitude for the painful journey that had led to this moment of genuine peace. The price had been high, but the reward, truth, integrity, real connection, was beyond value. The Oxford Federal Correctional Institution in Wisconsin operated on rigid schedules and limited freedoms. For inmate Deborah 87463-054, formerly known as Thaddeus Morissette, each day followed the same pattern: meals at designated times, work assignment in the facility's library, mandated counseling sessions, and strictly regulated recreation periods. Today marked 1 year since his sentencing. 1 year since he had stood in the courtroom and listened as Judge Palmer delivered her decision, accepting the plea agreement, but adding her own pointed comments about the calculated cruelty and profound betrayal of trust his actions represented. Thaddeus sat opposite Dr. Farhad Mirza, the prison psychologist who had been working with him for the past 6 months. The office, small, institutional, but made somewhat more welcoming by plants and artwork, had become a space where Thaddeus reluctantly confronted truths about himself he had spent a lifetime avoiding. "It's been a year," Dr. Mirza noted. "How are you reflecting on that milestone?" Thaddeus shifted in his chair. These sessions still made him uncomfortable, still felt like a violation of his privacy, an intrusion into spaces he preferred to keep sealed. "It doesn't feel like a milestone," he replied finally. "Just another day in a succession of identical days." "I understand that perspective," Dr. Mirza acknowledged, "but anniversaries often trigger deeper reflections, whether we intend them to or not. Have you been thinking about your life before incarceration?" Thaddeus gazed out the small window, which offered a view of the prison yard, and beyond it, rolling Wisconsin farmland. "I've been thinking about patterns, cycles, the way certain behaviors repeated throughout my life. What specific patterns have you noticed?" "Control," Thaddeus said after a moment. "Everything I did, in business, in my marriage, with Vega, with Rebecca, was about maintaining control. When I felt it slipping, I became desperate, willing to do things I wouldn't normally consider." Dr. Mirza nodded, encouraging him to continue. "I told myself I was helping Eleanor by replacing her medications, that she was obsessed with having a child to an unhealthy degree, that I was protecting her from further disappointment." Thaddeus's voice grew quiet. "But that wasn't true. I was protecting myself from the demands of fatherhood, from the loss of her exclusive attention, from the messy, unpredictable reality of creating another life." "That's a significant insight," Dr. Mirza observed. "Have you shared these reflections with Eleanor in your letters?" Thaddeus shook his head. "I've written to her several times. She's never responded. I don't blame her." "And yet you continue to write." "Yes." "Why?" The question hung in the air between them. Why indeed? What purpose did these unanswered letters serve? What need did they fulfill? "At first I told myself it was to make amends," Thaddeus admitted, "to explain myself, to ask forgiveness. But I've come to realize it's more selfish than that. Writing to Eleanor is my way of maintaining some connection to my previous life, to the person I was." He met Dr. Mirza's gaze directly. "And perhaps it's another form of control, trying to manage how she sees me, even now." Dr. Mirza made a note in his file. "You've made remarkable progress in recognizing these patterns. The next step is developing new ones." After the session ended, Thaddeus was escorted back to his unit, a dormitory-style arrangement that housed 20 inmates in an open space. His assigned area contained a narrow bed, a small desk, and limited storage for personal items. On the desk sat the few possessions he valued: a book of poetry Eleanor had given him early in their marriage, a photograph of his parents, and a legal pad filled with his increasingly introspective journal entries. He picked up the Chicago Tribune that had been delivered that morning, scanning it as he did each day for news related to his former life. On page 3, he found what he was looking for, a feature on the opening of the Rebecca Holloway Foundation's new counseling center in downtown Chicago. The article included a photograph of Eleanor and Garrett Holloway at the ribbon-cutting ceremony. They stood close together, their body language suggesting an ease and intimacy that made Thaddeus's chest tighten. Eleanor looked radiant, confident, purposeful, alive in a way she rarely had during their marriage. The caption noted that the center would provide free counseling and legal services to women experiencing coercive control and emotional abuse in relationships. It quoted Eleanor, "What happened to me and to Rebecca shouldn't happen to anyone. But if our stories can help others recognize the warning signs and find a path to freedom, then something meaningful has emerged from our pain." Thaddeus traced her face in the photograph, feeling a complex mixture of emotions he was only now learning to identify. Regret for what he had destroyed, grief for what might have been, and something else, a reluctant admiration for the strength Eleanor had found without him. His cellmate Davis returned from his work assignment and noticed the newspaper. "That your ex-wife?" he asked, gesturing to the photo. Thaddeus nodded. "She looks like she's doing all right for herself," Davis observed. "She is," Thaddeus agreed quietly. "And that her new guy?" Thaddeus studied the image of Garrett Holloway, the man who had methodically dismantled his life, who had brought him to justice, who now stood beside Eleanor as she built something new from the wreckage of their marriage. "Yes," he said simply. Davis shook his head sympathetically. "Tough break, man." She moved on quick, but Thaddeus found he couldn't summon the expected resentment. Instead, he felt an unfamiliar emotion approaching acceptance. "She deserves happiness," he said, surprising himself with the sincerity of the statement. "They both do." Later that night, as the lights dimmed for count, Thaddeus lay on his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. The day's counseling session had stirred memories he usually kept at bay, moments when different choices might have altered the trajectory of his life. The day Eleanor had shown him the positive pregnancy test, her face alight with joy, and he had felt only panic and resentment. The night Rebecca Holloway had called him, desperate and alone, and he had blocked her number without responding. The afternoon Vega had told him about her pregnancy, and he had seen it not as a miracle of new life, but as a victory over Eleanor, proof of his virility that he could parade before his failing wife. Each memory revealed a man so focused on control, on winning, on maintaining an image of success, that he had lost touch with the most fundamental human connections. A man who had sacrificed authentic relationships for power, empathy for advantage, love for dominance. As he drifted toward sleep, Thaddeus wondered if this insight, this painful self-knowledge, was the beginning of genuine remorse. Not the strategic performance of contrition he had initially offered, but a true recognition of the harm he had caused and the person he had become. 7 years remained in his sentence. 7 years of identical days in this place where his name, his wealth and his power meant nothing. 7 years to confront the man he had been and decide what kind of man he might yet become. In the darkness of the prison dormitory, surrounded by the quiet breathing of other men who had also made life-altering mistakes, Thaddeus Morissette faced his ultimate reckoning, not with the justice system or with those he had wronged, but with himself. The empire he had built, like all empires, had proven fragile. The glass towers of his success had shattered, revealing the hollow foundation beneath. But in that shattering, in that complete dismantling of the fiction he had created, perhaps lay the possibility of something authentic. Not redemption, he had forfeited any right to that. Not forgiveness, he had not earned it and might never do so. But something more humble and yet more profound, the chance to finally see himself clearly, without the distorting lens of power and privilege. To recognize that the true measure of a man lay not in what he accumulated or controlled, but in how he treated those who trusted him, those who loved him, those who depended on him. And in that recognition, painful as it was, Thaddeus found something unexpected, a small, fragile seed of genuine humanity that had somehow survived the wreckage of his life. Whether it would grow into something meaningful remained to be seen. But for the first time he understood that the choice was his alone, not to rewrite his past, but to face it honestly, not to reclaim what he had lost, but to acknowledge why he had lost it, not to control others, but to finally take responsibility for himself. It wasn't freedom, it wasn't justice, it wasn't atonement, but it was, perhaps, a beginning. 5 years later, The Chicago skyline had changed since Thaddeus Morissette had last seen it. New towers punctuated the horizon, reflecting sunlight across Lake Michigan in geometries of glass and steel. The city had evolved, grown, moved forward, just as life had continued in his absence. Standing at the window of his modest apartment in Lincoln Park, Thaddeus straightened his tie, a simple silk one, not the custom Italian designs he once favored. Today marked 2 months since his release from Oxford, his sentence reduced for good behavior, and his participation in the prison's rehabilitation programs. Freedom was both simpler and more complex than he had imagined during those years of confinement. Simpler in its daily routines, making coffee in his own kitchen, walking the neighborhood streets, reading the newspaper without time constraints. More complex in its emotional landscape, the constant awareness of his past, the weight of eyes that occasionally recognized him, the burden of rebuilding an identity from the remnants of his former self. His parole officer had helped him secure a position with a non-profit that specialized in financial education for low-income communities. The irony wasn't lost on him. Thaddeus Morissette, who had once manipulated millions for personal gain, now teaching budgeting skills to those struggling to make ends meet. Yet, he found unexpected fulfillment in the work, a purpose that had nothing to do with accumulating wealth or power. His phone chimed with a message from his sister Catherine, the only family member who had maintained contact throughout his incarceration. "Don't forget dinner tomorrow, 6 p.m. The kids are excited to see you." He smiled, grateful for her stubborn loyalty despite the family embarrassment his downfall had caused. His relationship with his nephews and niece was developing cautiously. They knew a sanitized version of why Uncle Thad had been away, but responded to his genuine interest in their lives with the uncomplicated acceptance only children could offer. The newspaper on his counter carried a familiar name in its business section. Rebecca Holloway Foundation expands international reach with new London office. The article mentioned Eleanor would oversee the European expansion personally, having recently completed a successful exhibition on psychological abuse at the Tate Modern. Thaddeus studied the accompanying photograph, Eleanor cutting a ribbon with Garrett Holloway beside her, their hands linked comfortably. The gold band on Eleanor's left hand confirmed what he had suspected from earlier news articles. They had married 2 years ago, in a private ceremony. He felt no jealousy, no resentment at this evidence of Eleanor's happiness. Those emotions had been examined and dismantled during countless therapy sessions, replaced by a genuine hope that she had found peace and purpose. If anyone deserved happiness, it was Eleanor. His phone chimed again, a reminder of his monthly check-in with Dr. Mirza, who had continued as his therapist after release. Thaddeus gathered his coat, took one last look at the city skyline, and headed out. The Rebecca Holloway Foundation's Chicago headquarters occupied a renovated industrial building in the West Loop. Its glass facade was etched with words of empowerment and healing, its interior designed to feel safe and welcoming to those seeking help after experiencing manipulation and abuse. In her corner office, Eleanor Holloway reviewed architectural plans for the London facility, making notes in the margins. At 43, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of a woman who had not only survived trauma, but transformed it into meaningful action. Her work with the foundation had expanded beyond her initial vision, now encompassing research, education, legal advocacy, and direct support services. A knock at her door preceded the entrance of Vega Ashford, the Foundation's Director of Educational Outreach. The years had matured Vega's beauty, adding depth to her striking features and confidence to her bearing. "The university partnership documents are finalized," Vega announced, placing a folder on Eleanor's desk. "5 schools have committed to incorporating our curriculum on recognizing manipulation and coercive control." Eleanor smiled, genuinely pleased. "That's wonderful news. Your program is making a real difference." Their professional relationship had evolved through stages of awkwardness and tentative collaboration into genuine respect and even friendship, an outcome neither woman could have imagined during the darkest days of the Morissette scandal. "How's Thomas?" Eleanor asked as Vega took a seat opposite her desk. "Starting kindergarten in the fall and convinced he already knows everything about everything," Vega replied with maternal pride. "Julian's parents are visiting next week, and he's practicing his Spanish to impress his grandfather." "And the new baby?" Vega's hand moved unconsciously to her slightly rounded stomach. visible even under her tailored blazer. "Growing fast. The doctor says everything looks perfect." Eleanor's smile held no trace of the pain such conversations might once have caused. After extensive therapy and healing, she had made peace with her childlessness, finding fulfillment in mentoring younger women and in her relationship with Garrett's nieces and nephews. "I saw the news about his release," Vega said carefully, the unspoken name hanging between them. Eleanor nodded, her expression neutral. "2 months ago, Catherine, his sister, called to let me know. She thought I should hear it from someone close to the situation rather than reading it in the press." "Have you had any contact with him?" "No." Eleanor focused on organizing papers on her desk. "The terms of his release include no direct contact with me unless initiated by me, and I have no intention of opening that door." Vega nodded, understanding. "Julian saw him last week at the Financial Literacy Center in Englewood, said he seemed different, humbled." Eleanor considered this information thoughtfully. "People can change. I believe that fundamentally. Otherwise our work here would be meaningless." She met Vega's gaze directly. "But some bridges can't be rebuilt once burned. Some betrayals are too profound." "I understand," Vega said quietly. Then, changing the subject, "Are the plans for London finalized?" "Almost. Garrett's flying over next week to oversee the security systems installation. I'll join him after the Northwestern Symposium." Eleanor glanced at the gold band on her finger, a simple design that represented the new life she had built from the ashes of her old one. "It's strange to think we're expanding internationally. 5 years ago, this was just an idea born from pain." "That's your gift," Vega observed, "transforming damage into healing, not just for yourself, but for thousands of others." As they continued discussing foundation business, neither woman dwelled on the past that had brought them together. The betrayals, manipulations, and revelations that had torn apart their previous lives had been transformed into a shared commitment to preventing similar harm to others, a purpose greater than their personal histories. The small cafe near Millennium Park offered privacy and discretion, qualities Garrett Holloway had specifically selected for this unusual meeting. He arrived early, securing a corner table with a view of both the entrance and the park beyond. Old habits died hard, even now that his life had found peace and purpose. When Thaddeus Morissette entered, Garrett noted the physical changes immediately. Prison had leaned him, eliminated the softness that wealth and privilege had permitted. His expensive suits and calculated confidence had been replaced by simpler attire and a more authentic presence. He moved with the careful deliberation of a man who had learned to navigate tight spaces and observe unspoken boundaries. Garrett stood as Thaddeus approached the table. Their handshake was brief but not hostile, a détente between former adversaries who had moved beyond the need for active conflict. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Thaddeus said as they sat. "I was curious about your request," Garrett replied honestly. "It's been a long time." A server approached, and they ordered coffee. When they were alone again, Thaddeus spoke with careful precision. "I wanted to thank you in person for what you did." Garrett raised an eyebrow, genuinely surprised. "Thank me? For dismantling your life, for putting you in prison?" "For stopping me," Thaddeus clarified, "for preventing me from continuing down a path that was destroying others and myself." He met Garrett's gaze directly. "I've had 5 years to reflect on the man I was becoming, on what might have happened if I hadn't been forced to face the consequences of my actions." Garrett studied him, looking for signs of the old Thaddeus. The calculation, the manipulation, the strategic performance of whatever emotion would serve his interests. He found none. "Rebecca would have turned 42 next month," Garrett said, his voice holding the mellowed grief of a wound that had healed but left its mark. "I know." Thaddeus looked down at his coffee. "I've thought about her often, about what I took from her, from you, from her parents. Have you contacted them?" "No." "Some harms can't be undone with apologies. Some forgiveness can't and shouldn't be asked for." Thaddeus paused. "But I made a contribution to the scholarship fund in her name at Northwestern, anonymously." Garrett nodded, acknowledging this small act of atonement without offering absolution. "Why did you ask to meet me, Thaddeus, really?" "Because you're the only person who truly understands what happened, the full scope of it." Thaddeus's expression was solemn. "And because I needed to tell you directly that you were right, about everything, about who I was, what I was capable of, the harm I had done, and would have continued to do." The admission hung between them, neither an appeal for forgiveness nor an attempt at justification. Simply an acknowledgement of truth offered without expectation. Eleanor is happy, Garrett said after a moment, watching carefully for Thaddeus's reaction. Fulfilled, making a difference in the world. A small, genuine smile crossed Thaddeus's face. Good, she deserves that, you both do. She doesn't know I'm meeting you. I didn't expect she would. Thaddeus hesitated. I don't seek contact with her. Her decision to maintain distance is one I respect completely. They fell silent. Two men whose lives had been inextricably linked by tragedy and justice, now finding an unexpected moment of honest communication in its aftermath. There's something I've wondered about, Thaddeus said finally. Something that never made sense during the investigation and trial. What's that? The surveillance in our penthouse. The cameras that captured me tampering with Eleanor's medications. I had the place regularly swept for devices. My security was thorough. Thaddeus leaned forward slightly. How did you manage it? Garrett's expression revealed nothing. What makes you think it was me? Because no one else had the expertise, the motivation, or the patience for that kind of long-term surveillance. After a thoughtful silence, Garrett spoke quietly. The building's security system was upgraded 3 years before everything came to light. The company that performed the upgrade was a subsidiary of a firm that had connections to my security consulting business. Understanding dawned in Thaddeus's eyes. You planned that far ahead? Positioned yourself to have access? After Rebecca died, I made certain commitments to myself. One was that I would understand exactly who you were and what you were capable of. Another was that when the time came to expose you, the evidence would be irrefutable. Garrett's gaze was steady. I didn't know specifically what I would find, but I knew, given time, you would reveal your true nature, and you had the patience to wait years for that moment. Justice often requires patience. Thaddeus absorbed this revelation, the final piece of a puzzle that had haunted him through his incarceration. Thank you for your honesty. As they prepared to leave, Thaddeus reached into his jacket and removed an envelope. I have no right to ask anything of you, but if Eleanor would ever want to know what I've learned, what I've come to understand about myself and my actions, this letter contains those reflections. No excuses, no appeals. Just truth, as best as I can recognize it now. Garrett accepted the envelope without promising to deliver it. I'll consider it. Outside the cafe, the two men parted with a simple nod, neither friends nor enemies, but men who had traveled a long, difficult path to a moment of unexpected truth. That evening, as twilight settled over Chicago, Eleanor stood on the balcony of the home she shared with Garrett, watching the city lights emerge against the darkening sky. The day's work had been productive, the foundation's expansion proceeding on schedule, her upcoming exhibition in London already generating positive press. When Garrett joined her, she sensed immediately that something had shifted in his energy. She knew him well enough now to recognize when he carried something significant. What is it? She asked simply. Garrett hesitated, then told her about his meeting with Thaddeus. She listened without interruption, her expression thoughtful rather than disturbed. Are you angry I met with him? Garrett asked when he had finished. Eleanor shook her head. No. Your history with Thaddeus is your own. Your journey toward resolution is separate from mine. He's changed, Garrett said carefully, not in a way that erases what he did or justifies forgiveness, but genuinely. Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. I believe that's possible. I've seen too many transformations through our work at the Foundation to doubt that people can change profoundly. She turned to look out at the city again. But accepting that Thaddeus might have changed doesn't mean I need him in my life in any capacity. Garrett removed the envelope from his pocket. He asked me to give you this. I told him I would consider it, not that I would deliver it. Eleanor looked at the envelope, her name written in the handwriting she had once known so intimately. A letter from a man who had been her husband, her betrayer, her life's greatest lesson in both trust and deception. After a long moment, she took the envelope. Thank you for being honest with me. Will you read it? Eleanor considered the question seriously. I don't know, not tonight. Perhaps not ever. She slipped the envelope into her pocket. The decision doesn't need to be made immediately. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the city that had witnessed their individual tragedies and their collective rebuilding. Below them, Chicago continued its eternal rhythm. People moving through their lives, making choices, creating connections, breaking them, healing, growing. You know what I've learned through all of this? Eleanor said finally. Through the pain, the revelation, the rebuilding? What's that? Garrett asked, his hand finding hers. That we're defined not by what happens to us, but by what we create from it. Not by who hurts us, but by how we heal. She turned to him, her eyes reflecting the emerging stars above. Thaddeus took many things from me, but he couldn't take my capacity to build something meaningful from the wreckage. He couldn't take my future. In her pocket, the unopened letter rested, a connection to a past that had shaped but no longer defined her. Whether she would ever read it remained uncertain. What was clear, standing on that balcony with the man who had helped her find justice and then unexpectedly love, was that Eleanor had reclaimed the authorship of her own story. The empire Thaddeus had built had been revealed as glass, beautiful but fragile, transparent in its illusions, dangerous when shattered. In its place, Eleanor had constructed something more enduring, a life of authenticity, purpose, and genuine connection. Not perfect, not without scars, but unquestionably her own. And in that quiet certainty, she found the rarest and most precious of victories, not over Thaddeus, but over the pain he had caused, not in forgetting the past, but in ensuring it no longer controlled her future. The city lights shimmered below, each one representing a life in progress, a story unfolding. Eleanor's hand tightened around Garrett's as they stood together, witnesses to the beauty that can emerge when broken things are remade with intention, with purpose, with love. Not an ending, but a continuation. Not merely survival, but transformation. The truest form of justice. If this story touched your heart and you want to keep following inspiring and moving stories, be sure to check out our upcoming videos, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications to stay updated on new content that can brighten your journey and provide valuable insights. Join us and keep exploring stories that truly matter. I'm sure the next video that pops up on your screen will touch you as well, so click on it now, and we'll see you there.